and they should share the set of values which are part of the European Union. Under those conditions, such a community would make real sense. I don't want to be restrictive in my description of who could join and what its powers would be, but just let me give you some examples. Political coordination, collective security, and that's one way of moving towards the construction of the security architecture which the European continent needs so badly. Energy. We've all seen the effects of energy interdependence in geopolitical terms. Infrastructure, the need to integrate new regions and existing regions in the European Union, and the movement of people. I'm struck by the fact that in many cases our dealings with countries operate purely through the prism of future accession to the European Union, but that's too long a term issue. In the meantime, issues such as energy, the future for our young people, transport, infrastructure, energy, all of those issues are neglected. So I think this would be a way of addressing those issues, to anchor those countries in Europe, to create links with the European institutions without overburdening the agenda. So, if you don't mind, I'll be taking up my pilgrim's stick. Of course, I'm very much a secular pilgrim, despite the long religious history we have here in the Alsace region. But I'll be going out to try to convince the countries and governments in question that it would be of some value to them.
Very concrete on making sure that it is consistent, that for those countries for whom they share and the citizens share the values and the principles and the fundamentals on which this union is based, then they should look to Europe as their home. This is what the Ukrainian people are asking us to do, and I think that we have reacted with such speed, but also our Ukrainian friends have reacted with speed in order to take the next step. Now, where does that next step take us? As the President said, there are different levels, different paths, but for us it is very clear that when it comes to further integration of countries for whom it is not only in their interest or their wish, but it is also our interest and our wish to see Ukraine at the very heart of Europe, just like we have to continue to dialogue with our partners in the Western Balkans and take those next steps, and also welcome the applications of Moldova and Georgia.
We see that Ukraine has a very special situation with a war raging on their soil, unleashed by Russia. And if I look forward to the near future, for Ukraine, it is of utmost importance that we will build a reconstruction fund to have investment in Ukraine. I've discussed with President Zelensky that there will be investment not only through the European Union but also the international financial institutions and other international partners in the amount of billions, hundreds of billions of euros, but this has to go hand in hand with substantial reforms. For example, reforms getting rid of the oligarchs, reforms against corruption, and other reforms that are so paramount and necessary in Ukraine. The good part is there is an enormous momentum in that country really to move forward with the investment and with the reforms. This might pave the way in a different way into the European Union. And therefore, we have to have this very special look to Ukraine. Ukraine is already very close to the European Union. We share, for example, the electricity grid, just to give you one example that is telling. We have a very deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, the association agreement. So for Ukraine, once again, there is a special path we have to pave in the combination of massive investment and reforms.
Une deuxième question.
Second question, yes, over there.
Thank you. Vincenzo Genovese from the Italian newspaper L'Inchiesta. I have a question for Monsieur le Président Macron. As a representative of the Council, would you please explain us how it's possible that the component of the Council in the Conference of the Future of Europe gave the green light to the final relation without assessing the content on the final relation, and it seems that several member states are quite unhappy with the conclusion of this conference. And then a question for all of you, because actually I don't know who can answer to this. Has the President, Charles Michel, been invited to this event? Thank you very much.
On the first question, as I said, I have spoken in my capacity as President of the French Republic, and I'm not second-guessing the views of the other members of the Council, and as I've already said, we'll have a discussion in the upcoming June Council. Of course, there are differences of opinion between member states, and that is why I've said that if we do wish to move towards a convention on the basis of the conference, then we're going to have to closely define the framework and the terms of reference. I'm not going to, of course, predefine the conclusions, but I am going to put in place a framework for the process. That is my view, but it is not my job as President in office to try and formally consult or engage the European Council. We will have a discussion of all of that in June. Now, this is all about the procedure and the dynamic, if I can put it this way. If we're going to reform the treaties, then everybody will have to be on board. If we are going to make progress, then I think that the way forward is via the treaty. So we will have to have a structured dialogue, and we've already started in some regards. So we'll wait, as I say, until June. And I think that it is this formula that we have been employing over the last year, and nobody has been not invited as such, but I think it was clear to Charles Michel that it was the presidency in office, along with the Commission and the Parliament, that were involved. And it was, of course, Prime Minister Costa who was here at the outset, and vice versa today.
The idea that we keep the formats that we had last year, also constitutionally, but of course all these discussions we will have in the European Council next month, and the positions of the institutions will be clarified, and that's what the position also that I will bring in that European Council is the one of the Parliament.
I think this is a very special moment, because what you see is that this outstanding conference on the future of Europe, with 49 proposals and 300 measures, gave to us an offer to work with it within the limits of a treaty or beyond. And what is so special at this moment is that we're taking this momentum from the conference on the future of Europe to show openness to a convention or the question of how are we going to deal with the treaties. And this openness, this is a dynamic we should use. There's a lot of hard work to do and a very structured progress if you look into the treaties, how a convention, for example, is to be decided upon. But I really cherish the moment of real momentum of European spirit to move forward.
Une dernière question ici, s'il vous plaît.
One last question down here, please. Good morning, Marie Chantré for TF1 Television. My question is for you, President Macron. The 9th of May, that's an important day, of course, here in Strasbourg. Thinking back to what happened in Moscow this morning, do those differences demonstrate that we're talking about two entirely different models, two differences of the world? What do you think about what President Vladimir Putin said this morning in his speech? In particular, what do you intend to do to ensure that what he said be taken seriously, bring the horrors of war to an end? Thank you. I think we've shown two very different faces of the 9th of May. On the one hand, there was a clear desire to dominate using violence, to hold a bellicose warrior-like speech. Whereas here, we've seen a broad-based citizens group working together to imagine and design the future of the European Parliament and the European Union, together with the language of peace, reconciliation, and the music which goes with that. So those are two entirely different approaches, obviously. The European project emerged from war, and that's something we should never forget. Moreover, it was born out of our desire to avoid any recurrence of that war. So this desire for peace, stability, and I would add social justice and environmental ambition, is a project which we have to continue building. We have to make it more democratic, more sovereign. That's one of the main conclusions of this conference, and we will build on those conclusions. President Putin, I don't like commenting on other leaders, but when it comes to adopting a warlike stance, we are clearly on Ukraine's side. We are here to help the people of Ukraine and the country to resist. We're there to help them with humanitarian needs and to take in refugees. We also continue to take sanctions against Russia with a view to stopping its war. And we also intend to act responsibly to bring about a ceasefire while averting the danger of the conflict spreading elsewhere in Europe. In the future, however, we will have to rebuild peace. Let's never forget that. I said it beforehand. We have to rebuild peace around a table with both Russia and Ukraine, and the terms of those discussions will be defined by Russia and Ukraine. But we would never achieve anything by denying the existence of one of the partners or excluding them. So, after 1945, Europe suffered humiliation on one part of it, and the same happened again post-1989. We know that the next few weeks and months will be difficult, but we are there for the partners, and we intend to show the same level of determination as we have historically speaking. What we have to do now is ensure that from now on, we can act decisively, taking strong decisions which will further strengthen Europe to make it indestructible so that we can continue supporting Ukraine.
Is that what you see before you is three persons that represent different institutions that came together today with a common message that not only are we here to listen, but it's now our responsibility to take it forward. Yes, we are in the context of a war in Europe. Who would have told us 1 year ago when this conference was launched? But it is because we are in the situation that we need to take this opportunity to be able to give the responses that we need. Some will require changes in the treaty, some will require political will and coming together stronger than we have ever been before. Some will require difficult decisions, but this Parliament and the institutions are ready to take that forward. And we have a responsibility within the context, in the face of being threatened, being blackmailed by Russia, especially on this day, that this is a message of peace that we give back and a message of solidarity with the people of Ukraine and a commitment to work and take this project forward.
Ich glaube, dass der heutige Tag Bände spricht und für sich selber spricht.
Today speaks volumes, and it speaks for itself. On the one hand, you see an autocrat, Vladimir Putin, in Moscow, and he has had his military parade. This is the only thing he has to offer his people. And then on the other hand, here in the European Parliament, you see a celebration of democracy. You've got 27 member states. You've got 24 different languages. You've got representatives of 450 million people who have enjoyed free debate and the exchange of ideas about our democracy. And I think that that is our strength, because behind this freedom we have our economic clout, and that is why today was such a decisive one. Thank you very much to all of you.
All right, a press conference there being led by three clear leaders in Europe. You've got the French President Emmanuel Macron, Roberta Metsola, European Parliament President, and of course Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President as well, wrapping up Europe's Future Conference in Strasbourg, France there. They talked about a message of unity among European leaders in terms of this war with Russia and Ukraine, saying that they are clearly, of course, on Ukraine's side, especially in terms of how they're implementing sanctions against Russia. They touched on Ukraine's long-standing goal to be part of the bloc, to be part of the European Union, and this idea by Ursula von der Leyen that countries that share the bloc's values, like Ukraine, should be much more welcomed into the bloc, and that they would welcome applications from both Moldova and Georgia as well. I want to bring in international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson, who's joining us live now from Finland. So, Nick, I understand that you were listening to that press conference as well. What stood out to you?
Yeah, the idea that there actually are some differences in the way the leadership wants to move forward. President Macron has been perhaps one of the European Union leaders who's put the brakes on expansion, particularly if you go back a couple of years ago, talking about the Western Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example. This has been an area where Emmanuel Macron, the expansion of the European Union, has been a bit of a holdout compared to other nations. And I think you got a sense of that, particularly listening to Ursula von der Leyen. Of course, there's unity. Of course, there's the unity that that Ukraine should be put on a path and helped along the path to admission. President Macron said that was clear. But I think the notion here that the European Union is a year ago submitted itself to this discussion of what it would take to, to bring in more nations to the European Union, and some have felt that that was not the right time. Macron was one of those. Has sort of has now hit upon a moment in history where actually it's incumbent on them, and there's a huge amount of pressure upon them to bring in Ukraine faster. But the terms of doing it are to meet the European Union standards, to share those democratic values. But as one of the speakers there, I'm listening so I can't see, but I think it was Ursula von der Leyen, said that, in the case of Ukraine, getting rid of the oligarchs. It is going to be a difficult path forward for the European Union as a whole, of all the nations, to come to this agreement. So I think that's what stood out to me, that this was a discussion, but now it's much more pertinent and much more pressing. But it's underway. But it did, as President Macron there, as France holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, he, in a way, and perhaps being the sort of most established European Union leader as well, sort of tries to set the direction, and it's not quite where some of the others want to follow.
All right, Nick Robertson, live for us there. Thank you so much. Right, still to come here on First Move, a show of military might in Red Square, Russia celebrating the Victory Day parade there in Moscow. A live report from Moscow as well, plus workers flooding past barriers and clashing with security guards in Shanghai as the city further tightens its COVID lockdown measures. The latest next. Welcome back. Russian President Vladimir Putin reiterating his claim that his actions in Ukraine is a forced response to Western policies.
We could see how military infrastructure was being developed, how hundreds of foreign advisors were at work, regular supplies of the most modern weapons from NATO. Danger was increasing every day. Russia repelled this aggression in a preventive way. And this was the only correct decision, and it was a timely decision.
CNN's Matthew Chance is live for us in Moscow. I want to remind our viewers that Russia has introduced strict laws regarding how the conflict in Ukraine is described, and also has prohibited the broadcasts of information it regards as false. So, Matthew, you were at this Victory Day parade. You were in the VIP section. Just set the scene for us. Tell us what you heard and what you saw.
That's right. Well, we got an invite this year to be in the stands, and so it gave me a sort of bird's eye view, up close view of this, always very spectacular display of Russian military might, of Russian national pride, and it's particularly poignant, of course, this year because it comes against the backdrop of that brutal conflict that is taking place in Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin, in his speech, which he makes every year to this parade, said that, as you mentioned, that Russia was facing an imminent threat and that it had to act defensively and preemptively. And so he yet again gave these justifications, offering no support for them, I have to say, for the military campaign in Ukraine, what Russia calls its special military operation. And that's been rejected, of course, by Ukraine and its allies. It was also a spectacular sort of bit of theatre as well, because you saw 11,000 troops march in step with each other across the cobbles of Red Square. That was followed by a display of Russian military hardware, including tanks and rocket launchers and even intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the full array almost of Russia's arsenal. There was meant to be an air display as well, but because of bad weather, we're told by the Kremlin, and it was very cloudy out there today and rainy out in Moscow, that air dimension of the parade was cancelled. And so it was a bit more muted, a bit smaller than we'd anticipated. There's also been quite a lot of anticipation that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, was going to use this parade as an opportunity to make an important announcement about the special military operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine. Maybe he was going to, say it was going to make a formal declaration of war. Maybe announce some kind of mobilization of forces to bring extra power to bear on the front lines there. But none of that happened. So, Vladimir Putin held back from doing that at this parade. But there was also nothing that he said, nothing that we heard or saw that would give an indication that Vladimir Putin or Russia is backing off and its military objectives inside Ukraine at this stage, either zone.
All right, Matthew Chance, live for us there. Thank you so much. All right, for more on all of this, I want to bring in Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy, Andrei Ilorinayev, who joins us live now. He's also a former Chief Economic Advisor to Vladimir Putin. Andrei, thank you so much for being with us. A lot of people are talking about the fact that this speech was notable more because of what Vladimir Putin didn't say versus what he actually did say. What are your thoughts on this speech?
Good to be with you. I think Matthew is right by saying that there was no basis actually to expect that in this particular speech Putin would make announcement for either new war or transformation of the so-called special military operation into real full-scale war, or for call for mass mobilization. Such speeches on the May 9th parade, it's not for this practical work. Those speeches are for making ideological statements. And this speech did serve this particular purpose. This is a very important ideological speech. And through this ideology, we can see at least three very important elements and components of the ideology. I would say ideology of Putinism. The first one is the announcement of new territorial claims to Ukraine. Putin discussed many names on the Ukrainian territory, cities and places, and the names of historical figures who, according to Putin, were fighting on our land, and this our land in the whole territory of Ukraine. So Putin was making very clear that he is making claims on the whole territory of Ukraine. Another element of this very notable speech is a very clear statement of against Ukrainian ethnicity, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian culture. Why it is so? Because in the slang of Putin himself and his propaganda persons, Nazism became a synonym of Ukrainian. And that is why fight against Nazism or fight with Nazis, it means fight with Ukrainians. So he repeated it 6 times in his
Right,
speech,
he's made that the focus.
Which means that he's really, yes, so-called denazification for him, it means de-Ukrainization of Ukrainian nation. And the last very important element of this component of this speech is anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, anti-NATOism. Never before, for 22 years of Putin's in power, he made such outrageous claims and attacks on the United States, on NATO, and the whole West.
Right, so you point out this idea that this speech was just to, explain and advance his ideologies. But so how did we get it so wrong? I mean, a lot of people going back to last week, the week before, were anticipating that there would be some kind of major announcement when it comes to this war, some kind of declaration of war, sort of, moving it away from this sort of special military operation to a full-blown declaration of war. How did we all get it so wrong?
I cannot comment on some mistakes made by some other people and experts and observers. But I think this ideological statement is very important. To some extent, it's even more important than proclamation of real war or mobilization, because mobilization could be temporal, war can finish. What Putin made right now, he proclaimed his ideology, which means that he's going to use all possible resources for all foreseeable future without any limitations to pursue those goals. So from this point of view, probably this even more important and more dangerous.
Stark warning there. Andrei Ilarinov, thank you so much for being with us, former chief economic advisor to Vladimir Putin. Right, stay with us. The Market Open is next. Welcome back. The opening bell sounding on Wall Street for the first trading day of the week. We have got a lower open for you. The Dow, by the way, already down almost 500 points, a continuation of last week's selling pressure, the fifth straight losing week for the S&P and the Nasdaq. Rahel Solomon joins us live now. So it was quite the roller coaster ride, Rahel, last week. Investors were weighing rising interest rates alongside the potential for slower economic growth. Is the volatility set to continue this week?
It appears so already, Zane. Good morning. Yeah, and it was the sixth down week for the Dow. When we look at last week's performances for the major averages, I want to point out something. Both the Dow and the S&P closed fractionally down 0.2%. The Nasdaq closed lower by 1.5%. But to your point, Zane, they don't necessarily paint the most descriptive picture of what we experienced last week, which was wild swings in one direction or the next, with the Nasdaq especially getting hit hard. The Nasdaq, of course, being the most popular high-growth tech names like the Meta, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, those names. And those tech names, Zane, don't tend to do the best in rising rate environments. We heard from the Fed last week that they were raising a key interest rate 0.5% and more. Rate hikes are likely on the way. So that's part of the reason why you're seeing tech get hit especially hard, these high growth names. The question, Zane, is have we hit a bottom or is there more to go? I spent some time last week on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and just to provide some perspective, when I spoke to traders and asked, well, what are you hearing? What are you feeling? What are you hearing from your clients who are calling? The word they used for me was anxiousness, not necessarily panic, but anxiety in terms of what we're experiencing. By the way, the Fed too doesn't know how much more they're going to raise rates. They have said all along that it will be very data dependent in terms of how much they have to do to try to get inflation under control, Zane.
And speaking of data, we are expecting a sort of key inflationary report to come out this week. Obviously, for the Fed, one of their key mandates is to make sure that inflation stays roughly around 2%. With rising prices, just how is all of that affecting consumer spending, Rahel?
Well, the consumer is so important, right? It's 2/3 of U.S. GDP. So, yes, to your point, Wednesday, we're going to get a very important report, CPI, Consumer Price Index, essentially how much are the cost of things like milk, eggs, gas is included in that, going up year over year. The last reading was 8.5%. That was the fastest pace in 40 years. Wednesday, the expectation at this point is 8.1. So that would be a slight sort of cooling of inflation, which the Fed needs. If we see that rate go up, well, you know, we are likely in for perhaps a rough week. So Wednesday is a very important inflationary reading. The expectation is 8.1. But why it matters is because at this point, the consumers appear to still be spending, but we know that that has its limits, right? At what point does the consumer start to become more cost conscious when the gas at the pump is more expensive, when you go out to eat and that's costing you more? And so we want the consumer to still keep spending, of course, but if inflation continues to sort of rage out of control as it has been, there will be a limit to that, Zane.
Yeah, consumers obviously paying the price for this. Rahel Solomon live for us there. Thank you so much. All right, slowing economic growth in China is one of the major challenges facing global investors. China's premier today calling the employment situation in his country complex and grave as Beijing doubles down on its zero COVID policy. Newly released video posted on WeChat shows workers clashing with guards at a tech manufacturing plant in Shanghai last week as tighter COVID restrictions were put in place in that city. The manufacturing plant is, by the way, a supplier to Apple. Selena Wang joins us live now from Kunming, China. So, Selena, we're seeing these COVID restrictions just affect everything from job creation to clearly employees and workers, but also the broader economy as well.
Yeah, a devastating psychological, economic impact on the residents. We're more than a month into this lockdown and still there is no end in sight. And just last week, China's leader Xi Jinping vowed to double down on zero COVID and to punish anyone who questions this policy. Because zero COVID now in China, Zane, is about more than COVID. It's also about loyalty to the party, loyalty to China's supreme leader Xi Jinping. So since those comments, we've seen these restrictions ramp up in Shanghai, even though daily case counts are coming down. Now in Shanghai, every single positive case is sent to a quarantine facility, many of which are in very poor and unsanitary condition. But now even people who test negative for COVID could be sent to these quarantine facilities. In fact, in several parts of Shanghai, entire apartment blocks have been forced out of their homes, sent to these facilities, all because one person in the building tested positive for COVID-19. In some areas as well, neighborhoods in strict lockdown are being banned from placing online orders to get food and daily essentials. That is sparking new fears about food shortages. In fact, in one viral social media video, you can see residents storming out of their apartment buildings, clashing with guards in security suits and hazmat workers. And you can see, in fact, in this video, the hazmat workers are actually beating some of the residents to the ground. And this outbreak happened after there was a fight in the building about food shortages. Now, this lockdown in Shanghai, I mean, this is the country's manufacturing heart. It has shut down many factories, and it is further worsening the supply chain nightmares around the world. But some of these factories, Zane, are allowed to continue operations if they have a bubble system where the staff members work, sleep, live on the factory floor. But that, of course, comes with its challenges. And in that video you referenced earlier in this segment, it's actually at a Quanta factory, which is a key supplier for both Tesla and Apple. You can see the workers in the video. They are jumping over the factory gates. They are overwhelming the security guards there. These lockdowns in China, not just in the big cities though, it's in at least 31 cities under full or partial lockdown. That's impacting potentially 214 million people. And as a result, people are losing their jobs, they are losing their income. Premier Li Keqiang calling the unemployment situation in China, quote, complex and grave. The unemployment rate in China is at the highest rate in nearly 2 years. But Zane, right now in China, the priority is zero COVID above all else.
Right, and that policy has had consequences. Celine Wang, live for us there. Thank you so much. Right, breaking news from Sri Lanka, where there is new political uncertainty. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa just announced his resignation. It follows weeks of protests against his government over its handling of Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis since independence in 1948. A nationwide curfew has been imposed after violence broke out between protesters, supporters of the ruling party. More on this story as we get it here at CNN. In the Philippines, people are waiting to hear the results of the country's presidential election after polls closed a couple of hours ago. The front runner to replace Rodrigo Duterte is this man, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., also known as Bongbong, the only son of the infamous Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. The election has been called one of the most important in decades, with the impact of COVID at the top of people's minds. Ivan Watson has more on what's at stake.
This was a big election. More than 18,000 jobs up for grabs. Everything from local legislative council members to the top position in the country of president. Some 67.5 million registered voters believed to be expected to cast their ballots. Not surprisingly, the economy at the top of the list of priorities for many voters, because the Philippines has taken a beating due to the coronavirus pandemic. Take a listen to what some voters had to say to us.
A candidate who is smart, that's important. It's also important to have strength, someone who is ready to help people.
Our situation is not good now. The prices of goods are too high. Maybe the next leader will be able to control it.
Poverty, jobs. I was an overseas Filipino worker. I am hoping that for us, we'll be able to find job opportunities here.
There are 10 candidates for the post of president. They include the boxing champion, Manny Pacquiao. According to polls, the two frontrunners are the son of the Philippines' late dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the son going by the nickname Bongbong Marcos Jr. He's been campaigning for economic renewal on a nostalgia ticket, effectively. Critics argue whitewashing the horrific human rights record of his father, who was ousted in a people power movement in 1986. Marcos Sr. had ruled under martial law for nearly a decade. The widow, Imelda Marcos, was seen going to the polls in the north of the country. She, of course, famous around the world for her enormous shoe collection, which became a symbol of alleged corruption in the Marcos dynasty. The polls show that Marcos Jr. is challenged by the outgoing vice president, Leni Robredo, the only female candidate for the post of president, a lawyer campaigning for democratic renewal after 6 years of governance under the outgoing president, Rodrigo Duterte. Robredo and Marcos Jr. Competed head-to-head in the 2016 vice presidential elections, and she edged out Bongbong Marcos Jr. We'll have to see when the ballots are counted who may have won at the end of the day in this large election. Ivan Watson, CNN, Hong Kong.
All right, more next on the war in Ukraine amid growing fears over the use of landmines, a danger not only right now, but of course for years to come. All right, recapping the headlines this hour, and in Moscow, a show of military might and presidential propaganda. Vladimir Putin defending his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine at Russia's Victory Day ceremonies and baselessly claiming the West was preparing to invade.
In Kiev, they were talking about the possible acquisition of nuclear weapons. The NATO bloc started actively developing territories adjacent to us. And therefore, in a planned way, we're creating an absolutely unacceptable threat immediately next to our borders. Everything pointed to a collision with the Nazism, with the Nazists and Banderites that was inevitable and that was supported by the West.
In a video message, Ukraine's President Zelensky hit back with his own plan for 2 victory days.
We are fighting for our children's freedom, and therefore we will win. We will never forget what our ancestors did in World War II, which killed more than 8 million Ukrainians. Very soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine, and someone won't have any. We won then, and we will win now. Happy victory over Nazism Day.
In Warsaw, the Russian ambassador to Poland has been doused with red paint. Sergei Andreev was trying to lay a wreath honouring Soviet soldiers. He later said that he was not injured. Meantime, in Ukraine, more reports of mass graves are coming to light. This one, discovered east of Mariupol, is said to be the 3rd site of its kind, according to the city council. CNN has not been on the ground at any of these sites and is, of course, unable, therefore, to verify the claims. A charity that's been saving lives for decades says that in Ukraine, unexploded weapons will be a threat for decades to come. Landmines have been used over wide areas of the country by invading Russian forces, and they're being developed in alarming new ways. The Halo Trust, a British-American charity that clears mines and other deadly devices, says it will take a huge and prolonged effort to make Ukraine safe again. It's been removing mines there since 2016, when pro-Russian separatists began fighting the Ukrainian government. James Cohen is the CEO of the Halo Trust and joins us live now from London. So James, you actually just got back from a trip to Ukraine. Just explain to us what you saw there.
Yeah, I went just about 10 days ago. Much of the country actually is untouched by war. It's such a huge country. You can travel big distances and not see anything. But you begin to enter areas which have been affected by the conflict, and the extent and scale of the violence is really quite extraordinary. Coming into Kyiv, you see whole towns that have been devastated by the fighting. And then suddenly you pass through that into the center of the capital city, and it's actually relatively normal again. So it's really those areas around Kyiv that where we are focusing at the moment. There's a huge need for our work. There's massive pressure on communities to return to their homes quite naturally, but they can't do that unless their homes are made safe.
What is the process? Explain to us sort of the step-by-step process of actually clearing and removing landmines.
Well, it's inherently dangerous, and if it's done badly, it can result in death or injury. And that is already happening. There are too many inexperienced people involved in the clearance at the moment. So the Halo Trust, as you rightly said earlier, has been working in Ukraine for some years, has the expertise to come in and begin this process. We have many decades of experience. We work in countries such as Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, Syria, and Iraq. So we can bring that skill base to bear, and we can make this process much safer. And we can also deliver the numbers, because this will take many thousands of deminers to begin clearing this very lethal ordnance. It's not just, though, about landmines, because there is a great deal of other explosive hazard there, including booby traps left behind by the Russians.
And how important is technology to the removal process? What sort of technology do you rely on to clear landmines?
There are many levels to this. Actually, the great revolution of this war is the availability of social media content, which we can then synthesize, put through big data processes, and really work out where all the contamination is. So that's been a major step forward. Drones are extremely helpful. And so are remotely controlled vehicles, robots, that can work in certain areas. However, this is still a process that relies on well-trained human beings to come into areas and do the dangerous work of clearance. It can't be done just with machinery.
Yeah, and it's so important to, for viewers to remember that because of landmines, because of booby traps, as you point out, even after the war ends, people can still be killed several months, several years, maybe even decades after the war ends because of landmines.
That's right. We work in countries like Angola and Cambodia, where the war ended many decades ago. But these devices are hermetically sealed. They're put in the ground to kill a soldier, but actually they'll kill or maim just as easily a civilian or a child many years after the event. There's something truly horrific about that. So we need to get on quickly, because if we don't, then communities can't go home, factories can't restart production, and crucially for Ukraine and the world, they can't start planting crops or harvesting crops. So, given how important Ukraine is to the world, food system, it's absolutely vital that the land is cleared quickly.
Yeah, of course, agriculture is going to be affected by this as well. And from what I understand, a lot of people there on the ground there in Ukraine are being told not to go into the countryside, not to spend time in the woods because of the threat of landmines and booby traps.
That's right, which makes it impossible for farmers who need at this time of year in the spring to be planting their crops to do what is necessary to make sure that food system is secure. Also, it's not just about the agricultural land, it's about the ports. If you can't get your crop to the port, you can't export it. So it's vital that the ports of Ukraine are also made safe.
So for people watching who are desperate to help in some capacity, what can they do?
Well, HALO is an international NGO. You said we're British and we're American, that's right. But we rely on the generosity of the general public to support our work. Our plan is to grow from a program of about 430 staff to one that may be as large as 2,000 staff. And by doing so, we can get on with clearing Ukraine and making it safe. We need to win the peace as well as hear about Ukraine winning its war. But we can't do that unless we're funded, and the general public can give very generously to our work if they choose to, and they can come and visit the HALO Trust website to donate.
All right, James Cohen, live for us, the CEO of the HALO Trust. Thank you so much for being on the programme.
Thank you very much.
And we'll have much more news after this break. All right, let's take a quick look and see how the markets are faring now. The markets have only been open for half an hour or so, but the Dow is actually down just under 400 points. More volatility apparently on the way. Obviously, last week we saw several wild swings, investors weighing the prospects of rising interest rates and also the potential for slower economic growth as well. And that had the markets seesawing in action. And finally, a show of support for Ukraine by U2's Bono and The Edge as well. From inside a subway station in Kyiv, at the request of President Zelensky, the rock stars performed classics like With or Without You and a cover of Benny King's Stand By Me, changing the lyrics to Stand By Ukraine. How special. Bono had this message about President Putin.
I think it's one man's war, really. And I think there's people in Russia younger people know what's going on. And I trust in the younger people in Russia to throw this man out of his office that was so high and is so low right now.
All right, that's it for the show. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll be back in a couple of hours with One World. Connect the World, Lenny Jokos is next.
Glory to our great armed forces, for Russia, for victory.
A show of military might in Moscow. Vladimir Putin defends his actions in Ukraine at Russia's Victory Day ceremonies. And
it's an atrocity. It's vandalism, he says. Probably the leadership is stupid. Only idiots would do this. Start a war against Ukraine.
Reliving painful memories, this World War II veteran thought he would never live to see another war. Plus,
I got slammed down by a slab, bent into a ball. Then another explosion, small rocks sprinkled, darkness. Then I looked, and the dust settled, and a ray of light appeared.
they thought they would be safe taking shelter in a school, but then Russia dropped a bomb on it. This is the story of one survivor broken by grief. I'm Eleni Jokos in Dubai. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. Vladimir Putin not declaring victory, but not backing down in a defiant speech ahead of Russia's Victory Day parade. The day observes the victory over the Nazis in World War II and honors the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in the war. Putin watching over a display of Russian military might, again making the false claim that he ordered the invasion to denazify Ukraine, and insisting falsely that Ukrainian aggression backed by NATO forced him to act.
You could see how military infrastructure was being developed, how hundreds of foreign advisors were at work, regular supplies of the most modern weapons from NATO. Danger was increasing every day. Russia repelled this aggression in a preventive way. And this was the only correct decision, and it was a timely decision.
Ukraine's president gave his own speech predicting his country will win the war.
We are fighting for our children's freedom, and therefore we will win. We will never forget what our ancestors did in World War II, which killed more than 8 million Ukrainians. Very soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine, and someone won't have any. We won then, and we will win now. Happy victory over Nazism Day.
Yes, but I can't hear your cues. Smaller Victory Day observances took place in Russian-held areas of Ukraine, including this parade in Kherson. No such parades in Mariupol, where images released Sunday show the visit of a Russian deputy prime minister. A statement by the city council said the occupiers celebrate Victory Day on the bones of Mariupol residents. Sarah Seidner connecting us from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Sarah, good to see you. You know, the ghosts of the past for many people that have experienced the war are now reliving it in the most dramatic of ways. And you've spoken to some veterans that have shared these harrowing stories with you.
Yeah, you know, there are very few World War II veterans left, and these two men noted that, but also said it pained them deeply to see places that they had helped liberate now being leveled by the Russians. Wasil Kluy helped battle back the German advance in World War II when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. His proudest moments helping liberate Mariupol by sea. We liberated Mariupol from the Germans in 1943. We went there with 3 warships and wrecked 11 different German ships, he says. 77 years after Victory Day, he has mixed feelings about Russia. It pains him to say it, but the country he once fought for has turned into the enemy, leveling the very same city he fought so hard to save from Hitler's onslaught. For all of us who went through the war at the time, it hurts. I want to take up arms now and go to defend the same places and my country, he says. His wife cannot contain herself as she listens to him and lashes out at the man she sees as responsible for the new war, Vladimir Putin. There shouldn't be anything like him on earth, she says. He kills, destroys our cities and villages. He destroys our defenseless people. On the anniversary of Victory Day, there are no celebrations here, only mementos and memories. It's no longer a holiday. It's very difficult, he says. There aren't many of us left. But Metodi Volinets is still here. The 96-year-old World War II veteran doesn't have to remember the terror of war. He's been given fresh memories. Russian tanks blasted a hole in the front of his home in the tree-lined suburb of Warsaw. He fought as a Soviet against the Germans, but has never had any love for the Soviets after he says he was jailed for speaking up against them. I was awarded medals and orders for victory, but I did not recognize them and never wore them, he says. He says Putin's Russia has started a war it cannot win. It's an atrocity. It's vandalism, he says. Probably the leadership is stupid. Only idiots would do this, start a war against Ukraine. Both men say they have the will to fight again, if not with their bodies, then with their words. Why am I smiling? Because I believe that we will rebuild this house and that Ukraine will win. And he said very clearly that his biggest worry after his house was struck was for his cats, who he loves, and his poetry and all of the books that he has had for many, many years. Both men, though, were able to smile about the work that they had done to repel the Germans during World War II. They just cannot believe that some of those same places are being completely bombed out by the Russians in 2022. Eleni?
Yeah, Sarah, and I have to say, you know, the one line that really struck me is that they're afraid that they're going to see another world war. And that's sort of a very ominous thing to hear at this point in time. But you've been covering the war since it began, and you've been seeing some of these harrowing experiences, and we've been seeing so many more atrocities that are being reported on a daily basis.
Yeah, it is extremely disturbing to go to some of these villages now that have been liberated by the Ukrainians, going in to see just how bad the damage is. And we're also hearing horrific stories of murders, of war crimes, of rapes in these villages. And there are many villages where people's loved ones are still missing. They were taken by Russian soldiers and they have no idea where they are. Eleni?
Yeah, and look, today is Victory Day in Russia, and what we've been, you know, we were hoping or at least anticipating to hear Vladimir Putin either committing to saying and calling this an outright war, or at least, you know, declaring some kind of victory, at least a definitive answer of where this could be headed. And we actually didn't see that messaging coming through, but rather him reiterating his overall stance on the special military operation in terms of what he's been calling it. And of course, interestingly, also mentioning a few cities in Ukraine that in terms of where he sees it now as Russian territory. Is there anything that you've read into Putin's messaging from today?
Look, I think people here have said you can't believe the words coming out of his mouth. You can only believe his actions. And oftentimes they say, look, when you think he's going to do something, he's a sly person, he will turn around and do the opposite. But the truth is that there is a war here, no matter what he calls it. And he has not conquered this country. He has tried to take over parts of the country, but this country is quite resilient and they are fighting back with all they have. Alani?
Sarah Seidner, thank you very much for that insight. Good to see you. Now, senior international correspondent Matthew Chance is in Moscow, and I do want to remind viewers that Russia has introduced strict laws regarding how the conflict in Ukraine is described, and has also prohibited the broadcasts of information it regards as false. Matthew, good to see you. What stood out to you about Putin's speech this morning?
I mean, I think what stood out, Eleni, is the fact that he didn't say any of the things that it was anticipated he would say. I mean, look, I mean, this was a widely anticipated event because it was speculated that Vladimir Putin was going to use this as an opportunity to make some important pronouncement on the conflict in Ukraine, which Russia, of course, calls a special military operation, perhaps make a formal declaration of war on Ukraine, perhaps announce some kind of mobilization of forces, because the military campaign has not gone as the Russians, we believe, anticipated it would go. It is encountering some problems. They need more forces to push it along if Russia is going to achieve sort of any of the military objectives that it set out at the beginning of this campaign. But, you know, Vladimir Putin didn't do that. He didn't say any of those things. He held back from it. I mean, what we were shown, though, is, as we are every year, a pretty spectacular display of Russian military power and of pomp and of ceremony. 11,000 troops marching in step across the cobbles of Red Square, followed by armoured columns of tanks and personnel carriers and rocket launchers, even the intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles, which are, quite sort of dreadful, really, and terrifying to see trundling across the centre of the Russian capital. But again, we didn't get any indication really about what Vladimir Putin plans to do in this special military operation in Ukraine. But equally, there was no indication that Vladimir Putin was trying was looking like he was prepared to back off it. I mean, to the contrary, he was consistently drawing parallels between the battle to defeat Nazis in the 1940s, Nazi Germany in the 1940s, and the conflict that is taking place right now in Ukraine.
Matthew Chance, thank you so very much for that update. Right, so French President Emmanuel Macron says he's in favour of a new entity called the Political European Community, and that would allow nations to join, quote, European core values, even if they're not EU members. He just wrapped up a speech in Strasbourg, France, at the end of the Europe's Future conference. In his speech, Mr. Macron expressed the need for a stronger, more sovereign Europe. And that wasn't the only key gathering in Europe. Several leaders, including Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, were in Warsaw for a donor conference on Ukraine. And this comes a day after Mr. Trudeau officially reopened the Canadian embassy in Kyiv and announced more military assistance to Ukraine. We're covering both of these issues, key events for you. Jim Bitterman is in Paris for us, and we've got Nick Robertson joining us from Helsinki in Finland. Nick, I want to start off with you. Seeing Prime Minister Trudeau, commitment and the G7 commitment generally with regards to assisting Ukraine, it's been quite phenomenal to see the visits, and a lot has been read into this in terms of how much they're willing to do to give Zelensky what he needs to win this war.
They're giving him the military equipment to hold ground right now, but they're giving him the prospect of time, and that's very important because it is going to take time to fight this war. That's what President Putin is making clear, that he has no intention of backing down. So what Zelensky needs is that longer-term commitment from the G7 to help with the finances of the country, to help Zelensky actually run the country, never mind fight a war on top of it, because of course the economy is utterly crippled at the moment. So he gets those two gifts is a strong word to say, but that's the support. That's what the G7 was outlining. We heard as well over the weekend from Justin Trudeau, as you're saying, visiting Kyiv at the weekend, getting shown around, visiting some of the scenes of where the alleged war crimes take place. And he was asked about his assessment of President Putin's current position on Ukraine, and Trudeau said quite clearly Putin is out of touch, doesn't understand what's happening. This is how he framed it.
I don't think it much matters what Putin says anymore. He has demonstrated that he does not have a clear understanding of what's going on. He so profoundly miscalculated by not understanding the extent to which Ukrainians would fight like the heroes they are to defend their language, their identity, their territory.
But Putin's misunderstanding, as Justin Trudeau frames it there, is the basis of his propaganda. And that was another thing that the G7 said it would do, would crack down on Russian disinformation. So that analysis that President Putin may have, that Justin Trudeau and everyone else points to as being wrong and invalid in the current context, the G7 committing to give a counter-narrative to help Ukraine.
Nick Robertson, thank you so very much for that insight. Jim Bitterman is standing by for us in Paris. It was really interesting to hear Macron's, talking about a new Europe, so to speak, or political European community, and being in favor of that. What would that mean? Are we talking about ushering in a new era for what it means to be part of the EU?
Well, I'm not sure I put too much into that. I was struck mostly by the words that that both Mr. Putin and Mr. Macron used. Both spoke of duty, and they either are using the word correctly or misusing it. But of course, for Putin, it was a duty to defend the fatherland that he believes includes part of Ukraine. Whereas for Macron, it's a duty to defend European values. A very different take on what this holiday of Veterans Day and it's the end of Europe, end of World War II, what it means in Europe on both sides of the line. And here's a little bit of a flavor of what he said in his remarks, a kind of taste of what he believes about the future of Ukraine.
What is our goal? Faced with the unilateral decision of Russia to invade Ukraine and aggress its people, to ensure this war concludes as soon as possible, to do everything to ensure that Ukraine will survive, Russia will never win.
And he said that, in fact, at some point, when this war is over, that they're going to have to get Ukraine and Russia around the table and negotiate a peace. And Macron, who's known to be a great student of history, taught a little history at his news conference. Following that, basically, he said it's important to remember that it was the humiliation and exclusion of the enemy, being Germany, after World War I, that laid the groundwork for the beginning of World War II. So basically saying we shouldn't make the same mistake twice. Eleni?
A lot of history lessons, I have to say, from world leaders. The question is, are we learning from the lessons of the past? Jim Bitterman, thank you so very much for joining us. All right, so the UN Secretary General says he's appalled by a Russian airstrike on a school in eastern Ukraine that was being used as a shelter. Dozens of people, including children, are feared dead. Sam Kiley spoke to some of the survivors.
This, for Vladimir Putin, is what a modern Russian victory looks like. Dozens dead or missing from a Russian airstrike on a Russian-speaking village as part of a Russian campaign that Putin says is to protect his kinfolk in Ukraine. The rescuers are saying the heat's overwhelming. Local authorities fear about 60 people died here. This was a school in Bilohorivka in eastern Ukraine. Villagers were sheltering in its basement. Some had been there for weeks. Survivors were left with little but grief. We asked if his family had been with him. His mother didn't survive.
It is not lost on anybody here that on the eve of Vladimir Putin's celebration of the Soviet victory in the Second World War over Nazi Germany, it is civilians who are suffering the most in the name of Vladimir Putin's denazification of Ukraine, a country with a Jewish president.
I got slammed down by a slab, bent into a ball. Then another explosion, small rocks sprinkled, darkness. Then I looked, and the dust settled, and a ray of light appeared. Sergei crawled out, and then he dug me out, dug Uncle Tolya out, dug Aunt Ira out. We crawled, all in a fog, he said. Ukraine has stalled Russia's plans for conquest, so the Kremlin's added strategic sites like oil supplies to its target list and stepped up its airstrikes against civilians in eastern Ukraine, this week hitting a residential block in the strategic city of Kramatorsk. Ukrainian politicians refer to Putin's campaign ideology as a fascist creed they call Russism. Speaking soon after the latest airstrike, he said they shoot prisoners, they torture women and children, they rape, they loot. They go step by step towards Nazism. Such explanations for what is happening here don't really answer the painful question, why? Sam Kiley, CNN, Bakhmut.
Ahead on the show, Shanghai tightens its severe COVID lockdown even further. That's all coming up. Stay with CNN. All right, welcome back. And there's new political uncertainty in Sri Lanka now after Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa announced his resignation a few hours ago. It follows weeks of protests against his government over his handling of Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis since independence in 1948. A nationwide curfew has been imposed after violence broke out between protesters and supporters of the ruling party. Now, Selina Wang is in Kunming in southwestern China. We're going to be focusing on the story in China at this moment in time. We want to bring to your attention that 31 Chinese cities are under full or partial lockdown. And Selina, this is incredible to hear that millions of people are currently experiencing lockdown across China. This is not only of major concern in terms of what it means economically, but the social impact must be extraordinary.
And Eleni, in Shanghai, people have been locked in their homes for some people more than 2 months, and still there is no end in sight, taking a huge psychological, mental health toll on its people getting more desperate and angry. And just last week, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, he doubled down on the zero COVID policy, even warning punishment for anybody who questions this policy, because zero COVID in China now is not just about COVID, it's also about loyalty to the party, loyalty to China's supreme leader. So since those statements from Xi Jinping, we have seen restrictions ramp up in Shanghai, even though the COVID reported case numbers are coming down every single day. Now in Shanghai, every single positive COVID case has to be sent to a government quarantine facility. Many of those are in very poor and unsanitary condition. But now even some people who test negative for COVID are being sent to these quarantine facilities. In fact, some entire apartment compounds are all being forced out of their homes, sent to quarantine just over one positive COVID case. Some neighborhoods in strict lockdown are also now banning people from placing orders online to get food and daily essentials. That is sparking new fear about food shortages. And we're seeing increasing clashes between residents and police. In one apartment compound, you can see in this video, the residents are storming out of their apartment gate, clashing with the security workers in hazmat suits. This fight broke out over disputes about food supplies. You can even see some of the security workers beating the residents down to the ground. A huge mental health impact for the people of Shanghai here, Eleni.
All right, Selina, thank you so very much. I want to take a look at what the markets in the US are doing right now. And of course, we had a very volatile last few days of the week after the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates late last week. Let's take a look to see what the markets are doing at this point in time. As you can see, the Dow Jones is down 1.4%, the Nasdaq taking a 2.7% knock, and the S&P 500 down over 2%. In Europe, also a red picture. And over in Asia, Shanghai Composite up slightly, but overall a very red day. And this has really got to do with investors starting to price in what it means to see an end to the easing cycle that, of course, has been boosting markets for such a long time. We're heading into a period of uncertainty, and people are really concerned about a possible recession in the United States. So major roller coaster for US markets and possibly for the rest of the world as well. All right. Coming up now, Vladimir Putin marks Russia's victory over the Nazis. What did we learn from that speech about the war he's waging in Ukraine? That's coming up. Welcome back. I'm Eleni Jakas in Dubai, and you're watching Connect the World. Pride, patriotism and power. As Russia wages war in Ukraine, the country marked its 1945 defeat of Nazi Germany. Victory Day is an important holiday in Russia. President Vladimir Putin drew parallels with the current conflict, baselessly blaming it on Western aggressors. But his speech was notable for what he didn't say. He didn't give any sign he was planning to step up the war or back down for that matter. A planned military air show was cancelled. Russia blamed the weather. Across the border, Ukraine says Russia bombed a school over the weekend where civilians were taking shelter. 60 people are feared dead, and the UN Secretary General called the attack appalling. So, what can we glean from Putin's comments? CNN contributor and former Moscow bureau chief Jill Darty has been following Russia for decades. She's now with Georgetown University. Jill, really good to see you. I think there was this anticipation that we would have some kind of definitive line on where Putin is planning to take this war. It was either going to be victory or more aggression. And yet he just really repeated the narrative and the story that he's been building up to Russians since the start of this war. But one analyst said he actually mentioned a few Ukrainian towns and cities, and we should actually read quite a bit into that. But what did you think was important from Putin's speech today?
Well, I do agree that it was interesting. In fact, there was one picture that I saw of President Putin in front of the, they have these eternal flames, and it was to Kiev, you know, the city that, of course, is in the center of our attention right now. So, you know, this is really working with a lot of images. This is a very emotional, very deep holiday for Russians, certainly filled with happiness about victory, but also a lot of sadness about the people who died. So those were the images that the president was trying to kind of channel with the Russian people. And I looked at it as more a pep talk for the Russian people to continue with this, that it is very important. He linked World War II and the fight against the Nazis to what he claims, which is not correct, that Ukraine is a fascist Nazi state, but he linked that, or tried to, saying that you are fighting for the motherland, so the lessons of World War II will not be forgotten. And in fact, he said that there were troops from Ukraine who were fighting Russian troops, who were right there on Red Square as the parade happened. But I do think it was also a strangely almost negative speech, I think, Eleni. And the reason I say that is because there was a lot of this feeling that, and the president said this, we had to do this, and he would never call it war, but this conflict, we had to defend ourselves, that NATO was trying to push up to our borders and even attack. And Ukraine, he claimed, was trying to develop nuclear weapons. So there was a lot of this kind of, you know, we have to do this. We don't want to do it, but we had to do it. And last thing I'll say is President Putin definitely talked about the victims, you know, Russian soldiers who are dying because of this war. He didn't give any numbers, but he did say every time we lose somebody, it's very painful. And significantly, he said, and this is a message to the Russian people, we are going to help those families, especially their children.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. You mentioned the parallels that Vladimir Putin draws, and we know that some of the bloodiest battles during World War II were, you know, for example, the Battle of Stalingrad, for example. So there was enormous loss of life over that period. And then drawing that parallel to what we're seeing today, many people saying, of course, that it is baseless, that, you know, denazifying Ukraine isn't based on any fact. But is there anything else that we should be reading into in terms of what Putin's strategy could be, you know, specifically going forward in Ukraine?
You know, I think the lack of something very specific is significant, because obviously if the President Putin had been able to claim victory, he would have done it, I think, but he was not able to do that. So what he did was kind of say, you know, we have acquitted ourselves well. We are fighting the way they fought in World War II. But he's leaving the door open, I think, to further fighting. And this, I'm convinced, will continue. And he also made references in there, and you almost have to read it word by word, but claims to the territory, Donbass, Crimea, and others that the Russians control as Russian land. You know, our men are fighting on our land. Well, actually, technically, that is Ukraine. Russia would look at it differently, but technically it is. So he is laying claim to those lands. And I think he could expand that if he wanted to, that he would continue to try to lay claim to other parts of Ukraine.
So from what we understand in terms of what Putin would and would not do is that he would not admit defeat because it would be absolutely way too humiliating. He would want enough victory so that he could declare victory. And we're seeing a lot of activity, for example, in the Black Sea at the moment. The battle for Mariupol is currently still on the go with sort of one resistance that's going through at the moment. And then his mention of NATO and constantly talking about that was one of the big issues that forced his hand, basically. And it was interesting to see him still building up that narrative.
Yes, that's very important, Eleni. I think that was the other thing that I took away from this. It was not just, you know, conflict in Ukraine or anything, or World War II even. What he was talking about is the end of the Soviet Union. And what he says is America's desire and an attempt to humiliate the world. That is what he said, to humiliate the world. He also talked about, you know, the attempt by the United States and NATO to expand toward Russia. You know, I think here you have his attempt to say this fight is not just against Ukraine, because if it were just against Ukraine, it would be humiliating to say that you can't defeat a country that is much smaller and weaker than you are. So he had to expand it, I think, to make the case to the Russian people that this is really NATO, this is really the West, the United States, and we are in a battle with them.
Jill, really good to see you. Thank you so very much for shedding light on these issues. Much appreciated. All right, so during a trip to Ukraine, European Council President Charles Michel was forced to take shelter in Odessa earlier today as Russian missiles struck the region. He was having a video meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and speaking with the Ukrainian Prime Minister about the EU's ongoing support. It is full of logic. That is how the European Union's top diplomat is describing his suggestion to the EU. Josep Borrell says the bloc should consider using frozen Russian reserves to rebuild Ukraine once the war is over. Now, in an interview with the Financial Times, the EU's foreign policy chief says, and I quote, "We have the money in our pockets and someone has to explain to me why it is good for the Afghan money and not good for the Russian money." CNN's Anna Stewart joins us live from London. Anna, great to see you. How would this work, putting this money to work essentially to help rebuild or assist Ukraine?
Well, it's an interesting measure and one that has got support over recent weeks from, I'd say, EU leaders and also people in the US as well. It is full of logic, perhaps, but logic and legality don't always go hand in hand. And it's considered that this measure would face huge legal hurdles, in fact, because while these assets are frozen, they remain Russian property. And under existing legislation in various jurisdictions, you can freeze the assets, but it's highly unlikely you would actually be able to liquidate them. And that's something that the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen actually spoke about in recent weeks, saying this is a measure that would need to be done in coordination with allies and it may require new laws. Now, Josep Borrell also mentioned Afghanistan as a precedent, and he's right. In recent months, the US President Joe Biden signed an executive order holding back billions of dollars worth of Afghans' central bank reserves to be used for the people of Afghanistan, but also for litigation regarding September 11th. Now, that decision was considered highly controversial, not least given the fact that Afghan's economy faces collapse at this stage, but also the situations are incredibly different. The US is not in a direct war with Russia, and Russia's government certainly hasn't collapsed as it did in Afghanistan. Legal experts suggest perhaps the easiest and quickest way to release Russian assets to help with the rebuilding of Ukraine would be for the government or for individuals to actively sue Russia. Again, though, that does take time. Eleni?
Yeah, absolutely. All of these things take time. I'm curious about the assets of oligarchs and whether that could be on the table. And I'm sure you're going to say that, you know, we've got the same legal issues that we'd have to contend with.
Well, it's almost different legal issues, and it would actually almost be more complicated. And this is something lots of people have spoken about. We've got super jets, super yachts, big houses being seized all over the world. Why not use those assets to help people in Ukraine? But not only has it been incredibly hard actually to prove which oligarch owns what, because none of these transactions have been in any way transparent, it would appear, but also you would actually have a burden of proof there. You would have to prove that money used to buy those assets was obtained illegally or it was in some way directly related to criminal activity. So I think that would be even more difficult than using frozen central bank assets. Eleni?
Yeah. Anna Stewart, thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right, so coming up, Formula One takes on the United States. The inaugural Miami Grand Prix lives up to the hype, at least in terms of celebrity attendees. A surprise concert in a metro station that doubles as a bomb shelter in Kyiv. Thankfully, there was no shelling to be heard, only music performed by Bono from the rock band U2 and his bandmate, The Edge. The two were joined by Ukrainian pop star to sing the song Stand By Me. Meanwhile, Bono and The Edge also visited neighborhoods near Kyiv that were damaged in the fighting between Russian forces and the Ukrainian army. Right, so Miami hosted its first Formula One Grand Prix this weekend. Dutch driver Max Verstappen took victory, but it was the celebrities in the grandstands who stole the show, like tennis great Serena Williams, former footballer David Beckham, and basketball legend Michael Jordan. World Sport anchor Christina McFarlane joins me now. Great to see you. Besides the results of the race, also exciting, it seems that the wider question here, has Formula One cracked the United States?
Well, I think on the evidence of what we saw, Eleni, absolutely yes. This was the hottest ticket in town. As you can see, there were some 85,000 fans that turned out for this event, but it was really the celebrity buzz that set it apart. You know, not something often seen in Formula One. We had Hollywood royalty, music royalty, sporting legends, all jostling for position down there on the grid. So it's safe to say that I think this is firmly going to be a fixture moving forward. Very popular it was indeed, and a fantastic race to boot.
All right, so we're going to focus on the sport right after this short break. Thank you so much, Christina.
Hello and welcome along to CNN World Sport with me, Christina McFarlane, live from London. After stars of the sports world flocked to the Formula One track this weekend, Miami's inaugural Grand Prix did not disappoint. A spectacular late defensive drive by Max Verstappen saw him take his third title of the season after an ice-cold performance in the baking Floridian sun. And it was just as well the race delivered, because the sideshow off the track was equally as spectacular. Check out some of the stars and attendance, none greater than perhaps this awesome foursome. David Beckham tweeting a picture of himself alongside legends Michael Jordan, Tom Brady, and seven-time champion Lewis Hamilton ahead of the race, while another GOAT, Serena Williams, was living her best life down on the track with Sister Venus. Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union were there bringing some style to the occasion, as well as singers will.i.am, Pharrell, Shawn Mendes, and Bad Bunny, no less. Well, the build-up to the event generating a buzz rarely seen in Formula One, showing its rapid growth in popularity stateside. This is, of course, the first US-based race of the season, with Austin, Texas later to come. And we're still early in the season, but with 2 race wins apiece, this was once again a battleground between Ferrari and Red Bull. Verstappen had been controlling the race until a moment when things got a little spicy. A late safety car bringing Verstappen and Leclerc together, the Ferrari driver throwing everything at it for 5 laps. But world champions' superior pace and skill would eventually win out for an unexpectedly dramatic finish, marking a 3rd podium for Verstappen in 5 races and a 2nd back-to-back.
Incredible Grand Prix, very physical as well, but I think we kept it exciting until the end. Yeah, I'm incredibly happy with winning here in Miami. It was yeah, an incredible Sunday for us.
So we need to keep pushing. Upgrades will be very important throughout the year, and I hope now that we can do a step up at from next race onwards. But yeah, it's been tight since the beginning of the season, and that's what we like to see.
As things stand, Verstappen closing the gap on rival Charles Leclerc, who still holds the superior point tally. Amanda Davis was trackside this weekend and has been taking the temperature on what we can expect as the season unfolds.
For all the A-listers here in Miami, lucky enough to have got their hands on the hottest ticket in town, Max Verstappen made sure to remind everyone who is the real star of this show at the moment. The defending world champion driving with all the confidence of a man at the top of his game, stealing the lead from his championship rival Charles Leclerc to claim his third victory of the season despite a less than perfect race build-up. It is the man from Ferrari still leading the way, though, in the standings. So what did the two team principals make of it after the race? I spoke to them to find out.
I thought it was going to be a tough one to win, but Max, the crucial part was, first of all, the start, managing to split the Ferraris, and then he just hung with Charles and was able to look after that right front tyre and then make the pass and then really control the race. From that point he was fully in control, and then unfortunately the safety car brought them right back together, and then it took a while to break the DRS, which was very powerful here, but no mistakes, and he managed to bring it home, so it was a great win.
Mattia, perhaps not the win you were hoping for, but how do you assess it as a day?
As you said, I think starting on the first row you are always hoping for a better result, and not winning is always somehow disappointing at that stage, but being disappointed for a second and third place is great. But I think it will be a great battle from now to the end of the season. I hope that we can be part of the fight. We will certainly be determined, try to improve our car as much as we can, and starting from Barcelona.
2 wins in 2, is this the momentum back in firmly in your camp?
Look, there's a long way to go, and it's really fine margins with Ferrari, and another great fight with them today.
And after such a positive start to the season, and there such a sense of confidence within the team, what is the feeling now? Do you feel the momentum has maybe shifted a little bit away?
No, I don't think so. After 5 races, we are still leading both championships, both drivers and constructors. I think that we should be very happy with that one. The battle is very close, so we are in the fight. We are really determined to improve the car, and hopefully already in Barcelona we can be closer.
And finally, overall reflections on the first race in Miami and the reception that Formula One's received.
It's been a great event. It's been a huge event, and it's great to see the American public really buying into Formula One and getting excited about it, and they put on a show like no other, and it was a good enough race today, and looking forward to coming back in a few weeks to Montreal, Austin later in the year, and of course Las Vegas next year.
On the ground, it's difficult not to have been swept up in the excitement of this moment for Formula One. This city, so used to hosting major sporting events, has certainly put on a show. But from Miami and the newest race on the calendar, a real contrast up next to one of the oldest, Barcelona, and the Spanish Grand Prix for race 6. Amanda Davis, CNN, Miami.
OK, it takes a lot of tennis balls to defeat Rafa Nadal and Novak Djokovic back-to-back. But next, Carlos Alcaraz tells us what he was really feeling during his sensational week in Madrid.
I would say this is my best week of my life.
We're back with the Women's Super League and scenes of a jubilant Chelsea changing room Sunday after the Blues clinched the championship title for a third year running, and they did it after beating Manchester United 4-2 thanks to some absolute stunners from Sam Kerr. Kerr just missed out to Alexia Putellas for the FIFA Player of the Year award. Surely, though, this will help her cause for next year. She's now scored 20 or more goals in the last 2 seasons, so that's a second Golden Boot award, and the fans, well, they just love everything about her. Okay, turning to tennis now, and teenage sensation Carlos Alcaraz says he is ready to go for a Grand Slam after winning the Madrid Masters Sunday in sensational style. And at this rate, you really wouldn't put it past him. He's now the hot favourite for the French Open after defeating Rafa Nadal on clay and rising to 6th in the world rankings. This week alone, the 19-year-old star knocked out Rafa Nadal and Novak Djokovic, and then he beat Alexander Zverev in the final in straight sets. That secured his second Masters 1000 title after winning Miami last month, and it's his 4th tour win of the year. Alcaraz is playing the kind of fearless, irresistible tennis that could make him very dangerous at the French Open in a fortnight's time. Our Don Riddell caught up with Carlos after his big win.
You're still very young, just 19 years of age. The likes of Rafa Nadal and Novak Djokovic have dominated tennis for pretty much your entire life. How does it feel this week to knock both of them out of this tournament?
Well, I would say this is my best week of my life. Be able to beat Rafa, be able to beat Nole, and Sasa Zverev as well in the final. Playing in unbelievable tennis. For me, couldn't ask for a better week. So I hope to still playing like that.
I like that you call it unbelievable tennis, because that's how it looks to the rest of us. It is unbelievable what you're doing. And you don't seem to have any nerves out there. You never get nervous. How come?
I have nerves, but I'm trying to manage the nerves better than the other one, and trying to the opponent don't see that I'm nervous. And but trust me, I had nerves, a lot of nerves.
When you take a step back and look at what you've achieved in the last few months, I mean, what do you think? Do you have to pinch yourself? Does it feel real?
Honestly, I don't realize what I achieved in the last month. I mean, everything came so fast. 2 Master 1000, 1 in hard court, now on clay court. So if in the beginning of the season someone told me that I'm gonna achieve these tournaments, Barcelona as well, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe him. So for me, I don't know what to say in an unbelievable month for me.
How does it feel to be the most talked about tennis player in the world? Everybody was so excited about you at the start of the year. Now you're justifying the hype. People can't get enough of you. How does it feel?
It's good, no, that everyone is talking about you, and it's going to watch your match, to watch you. For me, it's pretty good. But it makes me a lot of power. Let's say power to play in the best stadium against the best player in the world. So for me, it's quite cool.
Are you now the favorite for the French Open?
I would say that I'm one of the favorite players to win the Roland Garros with the stats and everything. But I know that it's gonna be really, really difficult to win Roland Garros. There are a lot of great players. Rafa, Djokovic, the best player in the world, are gonna play there. So, but I think I'm ready to do a good results in Roland Garros. I'm ready to win Roland Garros.
Extraordinary young man. Okay, incidentally, Alcaraz has announced that he will rest ahead of the French Open, skipping the Rome Masters in order to be fresh and ready for the second slam of the year. And we end the show now with another glimpse of his road to victory in Madrid in our Rolex Minute.
I'm Eleni Jakos in Dubai. Hello and welcome to the second hour of Connect the World. With Russian forces bombing buildings and battling fighters in Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin is using the specter of World War II to justify his latest war. It is Victory Day, a major holiday in Russia, marking its 1945 win over Nazi Germany. The government marked it with a show of military might here in Red Square. This year, the holiday took on somewhat of a different meaning. Putin has falsely claimed Russia needed to defend Ukraine against a Western invasion and denazifying it. Take a listen.
I am now addressing our armed forces and the militias of Donbass. You are fighting for the motherland, for its future, so that no one forgets the lessons of the Second World War, so that there is no place in the world for executioners, punishers, and Nazis.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country is proud of its own role in defeating the Nazis. He predicted Ukraine would notch up another victory soon.
We are fighting for our children's freedom, and therefore we will win. We will never forget what our ancestors did in World War II, which killed more than 8 million Ukrainians. Very soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine, and someone won't have any. We won then, and we will win now. Happy victory over Nazism Day.
The pomp and pageantry is going on in Russia while civilians are dying every day in Ukraine. For more, I want to bring in former NATO commander, retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. General, really good to see you. We've been talking throughout the start of this war, and I think, Victory Day was anticipated to have some kind of clue into Putin's stance, whether declaring war officially or perhaps declaring victory. What did you think of what he said?
Well, I think he's put himself into a box, and I think his speech shows that. The Russian military doesn't have enough combat power to do what he thought it could do when he launched the invasion on the 24th of February. And having been restructured and going after Donbass, it still doesn't have enough combat power. On the other hand, he can't find a way to back out of his rhetoric and his claim for Ukraine. And so I think he believes he can handle it in the long term. Just keep grinding away, and eventually the Ukrainians will collapse spiritually, materially, and the West will give up. But I think he's making a mistake on that.
So, it's very seldom that an aggressor would admit defeat. It would mean admitting humiliation. And I think that Putin and his generals have just one choice: to try and declare victory in certain strongholds. And we're seeing that occurring in certain parts. If we look at the map in terms of where there's Russian occupation, Mariupol seems to be incredibly vital. And they're looking at port cities. We're seeing a lot of activity in the Black Sea. What are you making of, firstly, the story that he's building up in Russia in terms of rhetoric versus the reality on the ground?
So I think that what we see in Mariupol, at least as the latest information I have, is that the Azov group is still hanging on in Mariupol. So the Russians don't have complete control of the city, despite all of the destruction that they've waged. They want control. They want the southern corridor cleared all the way from the Russian border, so they can go after, through Kherson, go after Odessa. But they don't have that yet. And in the north, they haven't been able to really encircle the Ukrainian forces. There's a new pontoon bridge that's been put in over the North Donetsk River, and maybe that will give them some leg up. I'm sure the Ukrainians are working hard against that potential penetration and threat to themselves. So I think we're in a position, as we've been in, where it's a real struggle. It's a battle of relative reinforcement, relative logistics, of who can get there with more firepower sooner to be able to hold that battlefield.
I want to talk about Mariupol for a second, because I think we've been covering the battle of the city for quite some time now. And it seems very unlikely that Putin is going to try and withdraw it at any point. What would the Ukrainians need to gain full control of Mariupol, and what kind of assistance could the West give to the Ukrainians right now? And I know getting in and out of the city is difficult, but it just seems like such a vital city to try and save.
Well, I think it's possible that there are still Ukrainian forces that could infiltrate in and possibly reinforce the steel plant at Mariupol. How they would get in there, of course, we don't know that. But I think it's always possible because there's no airtight cordon around a big area like Mariupol. There's always ways to get a few men, 100 men, 200 men in and out if you're willing to take the risk. Beyond that, to really launch in and break open that Russian grip, that's a 100-kilometer, 150-kilometer attack. It's several armored battalions, maybe let's call it 100, 150 tanks, a lot of artillery, some infantry to go in there and push open and break that Russian grip on the south. I'm sure the Ukrainians want to do that, but it's a matter of relative combat power. And where do they want to deploy that combat power where it's most effective on a battlefield? So if I were in the Ukrainian position, I'd be holding on in Mariupol and still working against Donbass.
Yeah. The sacrifices of Ukraine, the Ukrainian army, and frankly of civilians, General, have been perhaps unsettling to the Russians, and that's, you know, very interesting that you say that Putin is sort of stuck in terms of what he'd be doing next. You know, the West has been very vocal about Ukraine winning this war. Zelensky has been saying it as well in terms of, you know, the potential for a second victory day for them as well. With everything that we have at the moment, with our understanding of where the Russians are and what the Ukrainians have at hand to fight, how do you think this is going? Are you surprised at the resilience, or are you concerned about where we are at the moment?
Well, you know, first of all, I think everyone has to be very impressed by the Ukrainians' resilience. They've been remarkable from the political level down to the individual Ukrainian soldiers. They've been, for the most part, incredibly effective, resourceful, agile, and they fought off a superior force, a materially superior force. Where it goes in the summer, well, the ground's drying out in Donbass. Pretty soon it'll be open for unrestricted armor maneuver. At that point, superior maneuver forces will be able to go out and outmaneuver the artillery and fires that have been restricting both the defense and the advance of the Russians at this point. So by June, mid-June, it's going to be a different battlefield in eastern Ukraine. Russians know that. Ukrainians have to be ready for it. They're going to need air power. They're going to need long-range rocket artillery, which they don't have in sufficient numbers at this point, either one. So I hope the West will continue to provide them what they need. I think it's feasible if the West provides enough military support in there that they can actually eject the Russians from Donbass.
Yeah. We're at an absolutely critical juncture for so many of the cities that are currently at risk at the moment. Thank you so very much, General. Really good to see you, and we appreciate your analysis. Now, in a village in eastern Ukraine, it is left sifting through the ashes after Russian airstrike targeted a school where some 90 civilians were taking shelter over the weekend. Dozens of people are feared dead. Sam Kiley spoke to some of the survivors.
This, for Vladimir Putin, is what a modern Russian victory looks like. Dozens dead or missing from a Russian airstrike on a Russian-speaking village as part of a Russian campaign that Putin says is to protect his kinfolk in Ukraine. The rescuers are saying the heat's overwhelming. Local authorities fear about 60 people died here. This was a school in Bilohorivka in eastern Ukraine. Villagers were sheltering in its basement. Some had been there for weeks. Survivors were left with little but grief. We asked if his family had been with him. His mother didn't survive.
It is not lost on anybody here that on the eve of Vladimir Putin's celebration of the Soviet victory in the Second World War over Nazi Germany, it is civilians who are suffering the most in the name of Vladimir Putin's denazification of Ukraine, a country with a Jewish president.
I got slammed down by a slab, bent into a ball. Then another explosion, small rocks sprinkled, darkness. Then I looked, and the dust settled and a ray of light appeared. Sergei crawled out, and then he dug me out, dug Uncle Tolya out, dug Aunt Ira out. We crawled, all in a fog, he said. Ukraine has stalled Russia's plans for conquest, so the Kremlin's added strategic sites like oil supplies to its target list and stepped up its airstrikes against civilians in eastern Ukraine, this week hitting a residential block in the strategic city of Kramatorsk. Ukrainian politicians refer to Putin's campaign ideology as a fascist creed they call Russism. Speaking soon after the latest airstrike, he said they shoot prisoners, they torture women and children, they rape, they loot. They go step by step towards Nazism. Such explanations for what is happening here don't really answer the painful question, why? Sam Kiley, CNN, Bakhmut.
All right, and Sarah Seidner is in Kyiv with a story of 2 World War veterans in Ukraine who have a lot to say about what's happening now.
I can.
Right,
so
Sarah.
What we did was sat down with these 2 different veterans. Both of them fought in World War II. Both of them live here in Ukraine, one in Kyiv, one just outside Kyiv. And both of them are very disappointed, disturbed, if you will, about the Soviets who they once fought alongside to try and stop the Germans, now leveling parts of this country. Vasil Kluy helped battle back the German advance in World War II when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. His proudest moments helping liberate Mariupol by sea. We liberated Mariupol from the Germans in 1943. We went there with 3 warships and wrecked 11 different German ships, he says. 77 years after Victory Day, he has mixed feelings about Russia. It pains him to say it, but the country he once fought for has turned into the enemy, leveling the very same city he fought so hard to save from Hitler's onslaught. For all of us who went through the war at the time, it hurts. I want to take up arms now and go to defend the same places and my country, he says. His wife cannot contain herself as she listens to him and lashes out at the man she sees as responsible for the new war, Vladimir Putin. There shouldn't be anything like him on earth, she says. He kills, destroys our cities and villages. He destroys our defenseless people. On the anniversary of Victory Day, there are no celebrations here, only mementos and memories. It's no longer a holiday. It's very difficult, he says. There aren't many of us left. But Metodi Volinets is still here. The 96-year-old World War II veteran doesn't have to remember the terror of war. He's been given fresh memories. Russian tanks blasted a hole in the front of his home in the tree-lined suburb of Warsaw. He fought as a Soviet against the Germans, but has never had any love for the Soviets, after he says he was jailed for speaking up against them. I was awarded medals and orders for victory, but I did not recognize them and never wore them, he says. He says Putin's Russia has started a war it cannot win. It's an atrocity. It's vandalism, he says. Probably the leadership is stupid. Only idiots would do this, start a war against Ukraine. Both men say they have the will to fight again, if not with their bodies, then with their words. Why am I smiling? Because I believe that we will rebuild this house and that Ukraine will win. And his biggest worry after his home was hit were his cats and his poetry and all of the books that he loves so dearly. He says, you know, after his house was struck, it just made him want to fight harder against the Russian regime.
Yeah. Yeah, Sarah, it's such a brilliant piece. I mean, listening to some of the experiences of people that lived through World War II and the lessons, and again, the mistakes that are being repeated, what really struck me is the fear or the possibility of a resumption of another world war. And you've been covering this war since it began. What are average Ukrainians telling you about where this is headed? I mean, we've seen incredible resilience despite the atrocities and the losses.
Look, if one thing tells you anything, it's here in Kyiv, which was once under assault. There are still sirens going off, but life is starting to return back to some semblance of normalcy. There are restaurants that are now open and with little street coffee shops that you can go down to the Maidan. People here are resilient, and they're trying to restart their lives as the war rages in other parts of the country. And part of the reason why they're doing that is to show that Ukraine is not going to just lie down. They will fight to the bitter end. The president saying they are fighting to win at this point. Russia obviously continues to bombard the eastern part of this country, but there are so many people here, including children that we've seen along the streets, who are starting to play war, if you will. It's both sad and showing their resilience at stop points. They are holding toy guns and doing checkpoints, trying to be like the adults, but everyone here is taking part in this effort. Everyone here fighting against any idea that Russia might win this war.
All right, Sarah, great to see you. Thank you so very much. Now, votes are being counted after pivotal elections in the Philippines. It's looking like there could be a landslide victory for a familiar name there. And Sri Lanka's political crisis deepens as its prime minister calls it quits. What happens now, with the country facing its worst economic crunch since 1948? Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has a huge lead in the unofficial vote count in the Philippines. If he wins the country's presidential election, it would be a stunning return of the Marcos family to power. He's the son of the former dictator who was ousted from power decades ago. Ivan Watson joins us now live from Hong Kong with the latest. Ivan, fascinating turn of events, but the return of the Marcos family, the son of a former dictator, why is he gaining popularity and what are his main objectives for the country?
Well, Ferdinand Bong Marcos Jr., he ran on a platform where he was calling for unity. It was a nostalgia ticket, so to speak, where he was talking about a golden age in the days when his father was the dictator, ruling nearly for a decade under martial law. With allegations of a horrific human rights record and wild corruption that's still being investigated to this day. But he was able to quite literally rewrite history in the eyes of the Filipino electorate. And these preliminary results that we're seeing thus far, they're unofficial, but they seem to back up what the polls were suggesting in the run-up to today's election day, which he has more than double the votes of the nearest rival, the outgoing Vice President Leni Robredo. So it looks like history is in the making here, an historical mandate, potentially electoral mandate for Bong Marcos Jr. According to one Filipino analyst, he thinks that this is the biggest majority mandate that a presidential candidate has had since 1969, when Marcos Sr., another Marcos, won an election. Now, I'm not 100% sure about that, but this is the kind of historic shift we're talking about. And it was echoed not only by the presidential candidate who comes from a political dynasty, but from his running mate, the vice presidential candidate, Sara Duterte Carpio, who is the daughter of the outgoing President Rodrigo Duterte. So this was a moment where two political families seem on the verge of taking over the reins of government for the next 6 years in the Philippines. And it definitely indicates where the population, where the electorate was leaning. According to the Electoral Commission, you had record number of registered voters, some 67.5 million voters. It is truly a remarkable moment here taking place. There were allegations of disinformation in social media, of fake news being spread, and of trolls and some nasty behavior there. Also reports of some of the vote counting machines malfunctioning. That will have to be looked at. Again, these are preliminary results, but the margins here, Eleni, are so big, it really looks like a potential landslide victory for Marcos Jr. Back to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and looks big numbers. Absolutely. We'll definitely touch base on the change in the political landscape in the Philippines. Ivan Watson, thanks so much. Now, Sri Lanka's Prime Minister has resigned following weeks of civil unrest and the country's worst economic crisis since declaring independence. Will Ripley is in the region tracking developments from Taipei, Taiwan. Well, I have to say, when we look at how quickly the economy deteriorated, inflationary pressures, and also the discontent that we've seen from the ground, I'm sure people weren't actually surprised by this resignation, but more so why it took so long.
Yeah, well, it's also the second time that he's resigned as prime minister. He's a four-term prime minister, two-term president. His brother is currently president, and so he certainly has protection from the top in terms of government. But on the ground, people are outraged, even though Sri Lanka has really been hit since basically 2019, with tragedy after tragedy. You had the Easter bombings, then you had the COVID-19 pandemic. Then just as the country was reopening for tourism, there's a major cargo ship fire that dumps plastic pellets all over their beaches, cutting tourism numbers again. So they're having a really rough go of it. But what these anti-government protesters are accusing the prime minister, the now former prime minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, of is corruption, financial mismanagement. And they're accusing that as kind of a family deal. I mean, already when you're a president in Sri Lanka, when you retire, you get a house, you get the car, you get security, you get an office, you get your pay, the pay of when you left, and then your widow gets that after. I mean, there's just a lot of people who are struggling right now in Sri Lanka to even put food on the table. And when they're seeing these political elite continuing to live the high life, there were calls for him to resign for weeks. He pushed back. They deployed paramilitary. They deployed police. They even deployed troops. But in the end, with so many people being injured, with arson attacks and these things going on for weeks and just getting more and more violent, the decision was made. The hope is that this will pacify the anti-government protesters. The question now, though, what about his brother, who still has a considerable couple of years left on his term?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I was going to say, in terms of succession planning or in terms of replacement, what is on the cards right now?
Look, it's what do? You have the opposition party, you have the ruling party. There are ruling party supporters out with crowbars fighting for their perspective. Then there's the opposition party. They're still trying to piece together what exactly is going to happen. You still have a president in power that these protesters are also accusing of corruption and financial mismanagement. So the question is going to be, is the prime minister's resignation enough to temper this for now, to bring the sides together for dialogue, some sort of negotiation, or is the violence going to continue? Are they really trying to completely change the leadership in Sri Lanka? It wouldn't be the first time that there have been attempted coups. This isn't a coup attempt. These are protesters on the ground fighting with police, fighting with ruling party supporters. So it's really a volatile situation, and it's anyone's right now guess what's going to happen in the coming days and weeks.
Will Ripley, thank you so much. Right, you're watching Connect the World live today from Dubai. Ahead on the program, Vladimir Putin defends his invasion of Ukraine using false accusations against the West to help justify it. With no quick victory in sight, will he escalate the war? We'll discuss that with CNN's Stephen Collinson. And I will talk more about how the West is responding to the war when I'm joined by the US ambassador to NATO. That's a little later in the show. Stay with us. Russia's president is defending his invasion of Ukraine on the country's Victory Day. It honors the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in World War II. Vladimir Putin used the occasion to praise Russian forces, but did not declare victory over Ukraine. He justified his decision to invade by repeating false claims about the need to denazify Ukraine, and perhaps more ominously, that Russia is preemptively defending itself against Ukrainian aggression boosted by military help from the West. CNN's Stephen Collinson wonders how much further Putin will go, writing, the US role at the vanguard of a broad Western front against Putin, which is resulting in heavy losses for the Russian army, is again raising questions about how far the Kremlin strongman can be pushed before he reacts. And Stephen Collinson joins us now live from Washington. Stephen, you know, is this a harbinger of things that possibly could come, as just how far Putin can be pushed? He's using the Western line as part of the reason that he invaded Ukraine to protect Russia. It's just whether he would really react to go beyond Ukraine's borders.
Yes, and I think it's clearly, as you say, a question between rhetoric and action when it comes to how Putin is reacting to this very strong Western push to arm Ukraine, to allow it to defend itself. And Western officials now speaking openly of the fact that they think Ukraine can win this conflict and they want Ukraine to win it. I think the number one goal of the West and President Biden specifically since this invasion was to ensure that Western help for Ukraine to repel the invasion did not mushroom into a wider conflict between Russia and the West, with all the dangerous prospects for escalation and even nuclear brinksmanship that could bring along with it. I think so far that has been successful. We haven't seen wide-ranging cyber attacks, perhaps, from the Russians that some American officials expected. There hasn't been an attempt by Russia to intercept the flow of weapons, at least outside Ukraine, that are coming from Western nations, which of course could end up triggering a conflict between NATO and Russia. But that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. CIA Director Bill Burns warned this weekend in Washington that Putin cannot afford to lose this conflict, and the possibility that this could escalate and Russia could bring to the table perhaps tactical nuclear weapons, or at least the threat to use them, cannot be ruled out. So I don't think anyone should be getting complacent here.
Absolutely. And that was the warning, right, that things could escalate pretty quickly. And what would Putin's move be? Because, you know, according to Putin, this war already includes NATO, just by de facto the supply of weapons. NATO and allies have stopped short of, for example, no-fly zones, saying that that would mean their direct involvement. But there's a lot of grey area here, and it really depends on how Putin is reading into this.
Right, and that was why I think it was very interesting. Last week we had several stories coming out of Washington about just how closely the US is allying with the Ukrainians in terms of giving them intelligence that led to successful Ukrainian attacks, for instance, on some Russian generals, on the Moskva battleship. Now, the US says that it's not giving targeted intelligence to the Ukrainians, but it's getting US intelligence, and it's up to them how to use it. Whether that is a distinction that is seen in the Kremlin is another thing entirely, of course. But, you know, going back to Putin's speech today, it was very interesting how he basically said that the invasion of Ukraine was triggered falsely by the West being aggressive towards Russia on its borders and arming Ukraine in the first place. In some ways, it suits Putin for this to be seen in Russia and outside Russia as a big clash between the West and Russia. You know, losing a war to Ukraine is one thing and could be embarrassing, but the fact that the West is involved, according to Putin, Western weapons are being used, Western intelligence being used, actually gives him almost a little bit of a propaganda way out here. So clearly it's in his interest to escalate the rhetoric against the West. What people are watching in Washington is whether there are any preparations by Russia to kind of go beyond rhetoric and try and carry out some reprisals against the West. And of course, this is something, if you look at Putin's record, interfering in US elections and everything else, this will play out over years, not just the months that this conflict goes on.
He definitely has patience, and we've seen that actually over the past decade. But you mentioned tactical nuclear weapons, and I'm worried when I hear, you know, President Putin saying we want to also humiliate the West or humiliate NATO. Do you think the two are interlinked, and that we have to be on high alert of Putin potentially using nuclear weapons? When we've asked analysts or NATO, or even just President Biden, he says, you know, we don't even want to talk about that. That shouldn't even be on the cards. It is not right to even consider this.
Well, the first thing to point out, I think, is that the US officials say they've not detected any mobilization of Russia's tactical, sort of lower yield nuclear weapons that could potentially be used on a battlefield so far, despite the Russian rhetoric. It's obviously in the Russia's interest to keep talking about nuclear escalation, to try to scare the West off, to keep this conflict within certain bounds. So that hasn't happened yet. A lot of people do worry, though, about the idea that Putin cannot lose this conflict for prestige reasons, for his own political position in Moscow, and what would happen if he got to that last resort and he might think about using one of those weapons. That, of course, is of huge propaganda value to the Russians, but a lot of people in Washington are very worried that you push him into a corner and he's so desperate he could take desperate measures.
Yeah. Stephen Collinson, thank you very much for that analysis. Now, as Russia marks Victory Day, Moscow's ambassador to Poland got a hostile reception in Warsaw. Sergei Andreev was doused with what looks like red paint as he tried to lay a wreath at the cemetery of Soviet soldiers. Russian state news agency RIA Novosti said Poles and Ukrainians blocked the ambassador's path. The ambassador later said he was not injured and police escorted him out of the cemetery. The Russian embassy in Poland has said it will formally protest against the attack. Now, North Korea is watching what happens in Ukraine very closely, and more importantly, the international reaction to Russia's actions. CNN's Paula Hancock explains.
Meeting for the first time in 2019, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin revived a decades-long alliance. North Korea has unsurprisingly sided with Russia, calling the US, quote, the root cause of the Ukrainian crisis, the war reinforcing a basic lesson.
Only one, but very important. Never, ever surrender your nuclear weapons. They have known it anyway for decades, and now they got yet another confirmation. After Iraq, after Libya.
Pyongyang often makes the connection between the former leaders of Iraq and Libya giving up their nuclear ambitions, then losing power and ultimately their lives. Ukraine agreed to transfer thousands of nuclear warheads to Russia after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. It did not have an independent weapons program.
I think the war in Ukraine really affirms the North Korean view of how the world works. The North Koreans, I think, have persistently rejected the idea of any form of international order really having an effect on how states relate to each other.
Kim is experiencing the most favourable weapons testing environment he has seen in his 10 years in power. A split among United Nations Security Council permanent members, Russia and China on one side, the US, UK and France on the other, means the chances of punishing North Korea are zero.
It's quite clear that China and Russia will block additional sanctions, and frankly it's not quite clear what else can you possibly sanction.
North Korea has launched more than a dozen missiles already this year, including an intercontinental ballistic missile. Satellite imagery of the Punggye-ri underground testing site suggests a seventh nuclear test may also be imminent. North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. The thought it might try again has long been dismissed. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the West's refusal to fight directly against a nuclear power is at least raising the question.
Maybe, just maybe, this American president of the year 2045 or 2055 will not risk San Francisco in order to save Seoul.
North Korea could also benefit potentially from countries boycotting Russian oil and gas. Cash-strapped Pyongyang would be more than happy to pick up some of the slack for Moscow, potentially at a discount, and certainly would appreciate dealing with a country that no longer feels constrained by US-led sanctions. Paula Hancock, CNN Seoul.
And still ahead, I will be speaking to the US ambassador to NATO, and she says this is a day to remember the lessons from the Second World War as Europe is again under threat. May 9th, it's Victory Day in Russia, and it's also a major holiday marking its 1945 win over Nazi Germany. And Vladimir Putin has used the occasion to level another accusation of undue aggression at NATO.
We could see how military infrastructure was being developed, how hundreds of foreign advisors were at work, regular supplies of the most modern weapons from NATO. Danger was increasing every day. Russia repelled this aggression in a preventive way. And this was the only correct decision, and it was a timely decision.
NATO, for its part, has strongly condemned Russia's invasion. Now, the US ambassador to the military alliance tweeting Tuesday that Putin's unjustified war is an assault on the people of Ukraine, including mothers and children. Joining me now is Julianne Smith, the US ambassador to NATO. Ambassador, thank you so very much for taking the time. Really good to see you. We listened to Vladimir Putin's speech. I think there was an anticipation to sort of get a definitive view in terms of where he's taking this war. Is there anything that stood out for you and for NATO, perhaps in terms of showing where Putin plans to stop?
Well, I think the speech really wasn't that surprising. What we heard from President Putin are the same lines that we've heard over and over during this unprovoked war in Ukraine. He continues to put forward lies and disinformation about NATO's role in Ukraine. You heard in the clip previously that he was trying to accuse NATO of somehow starting this aggression, when in reality, what happened here is clearly Russia went into Ukraine. NATO remains a defensive alliance, and yes, individual allies have started providing lethal assistance to the Ukrainian military. But what Putin put out was completely detached from reality. So no, it wasn't that surprising. The only thing that was a bit surprising is some thought perhaps he would declare victory. He did not. And that's based on the fact that he doesn't have any victory to point to. His troops are not succeeding on the ground in Ukraine, and there's nothing for him to celebrate. So this was a speech, again, that did not reflect events on the ground, and it's sad that on this day, on Victory Day, that he's celebrating aggression and oppression at the same time.
Absolutely. Look, he also mentioned that part of the reason that he was forced to invade Ukraine is because of NATO's move east. And you've just said that NATO has and allies have been providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. For Putin, under the way he views it, he thinks that NATO is already involved in his war in Ukraine. What will you do? What will NATO do if Putin takes this assault, encroaches on NATO territory and a member country, and is that your prognosis at this point?
Well, I think right now what we're trying to do is individual NATO allies are providing security assistance to the Ukrainian military to help them succeed on the ground. NATO is also looking at ways in which it can reinforce its eastern flank to address the real security concerns that those countries have. And the transatlantic partners continue to apply maximum and unprecedented pressure on Moscow. That will remain the plan. Our goal is to end the war in Ukraine. We don't want to see it expanded. Just on Putin's point, though, about Russia accusing NATO of moving forces into Eastern Europe closer to Ukraine, the only time NATO troops moved closer to Ukraine was after Russia went into Ukraine in 2014 in the attempted annexation of Crimea, and then after Russia went back into Ukraine just earlier this year on February 24th, NATO did move additional forces into Eastern Europe. He likes to portray it as the reverse, that NATO was the first to make the move, but in reality, NATO's responding to Russian aggression inside Ukraine.
He's absolutely been flipping the narrative. I want to talk about Finland and Sweden. We spoke to many people from both countries in terms of potential of joining NATO. Have you had any formal applications from those countries? And what are you doing right now in terms of gaining more members to NATO at this point?
Well, Finland and Sweden have not officially taken any decision to join the NATO alliance, but I think what they've heard from the Biden administration, what they've heard from other NATO allies, is that there is strong support for both of them should they decide to join the alliance. These are two countries that are very close partners to the NATO alliance, two countries that share NATO values, and two countries that have exceptional militaries. We've exercised with them, we've trained with these forces, we've been on joint missions together, and for that reason, I think should they decide to formally request membership at any time in the coming days and weeks, they would find that the enthusiasm here at NATO headquarters to be quite high.
Ambassador, one more question. We are again bringing up the issue of possibility of tactical nuclear weapons being used by Vladimir Putin, only because he was talking about wanting to humiliate NATO and the West. Are you looking at this as a possible scenario?
Well, we take any mention of nuclear weapons very seriously. We worry. We find that type of language to be very dangerous. We would like to see the nuclear saber rattling to stop. And obviously, that's something that we do discuss with our allies here at NATO. We hope that this is just simply rhetoric and that he will hold back and refrain from turning to any use of nuclear weapons.
Ambassador, really good to see you. Thank you so very much for taking the time. And some news just in to CNN, and Britain's opposition Labour Party leader Keir Starmer says if he's fined by police over COVID breaches, he will resign. British police recently said they will investigate an alleged lockdown gathering attended by Starmer in April of last year. It marks the latest twist in the so-called Partygate scandal, which has engulfed UK politics for months. Take a listen.
I'm absolutely clear that no laws were broken. They were followed at all times. I simply had something to eat while working late in the evening, as any politician would do days before an election. But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course, do the right thing and step down.
Right, Keir Starmer there, and we'll continue to monitor that story. Now, coming up, 5.7 million refugees have fled Ukraine. One neighbour is doing its part to accommodate those seeking safe haven. A surprise concert in a metro station that doubles as a bomb shelter in Kyiv. And thankfully, there was no shelling to be heard, only music performed by Bono. from the rock band U2 and his bandmate The Edge. They performed a 40-minute set and praised Ukrainians for their defiance in the face of the Russian invasion. Bono and The Edge also visited neighborhoods near Kyiv that were damaged in the fighting between Russian forces and the Ukrainian army. Bono says Russian President Vladimir Putin is to blame for this.
I think it's one man's war, really. And I think these people in Russia younger people know what's going on. And I trust in the younger people in Russia to throw this man out of his office that was so high and is so low right now.
Ukraine had other high-profile visitors over the weekend. One of those, US First Lady Jill Biden. She crossed into the country from Slovakia, meeting with Ukraine's First Lady Olena Zelensky on Sunday. This is the first time Mrs. Zelensky has been seen in public since the war began, and they gathered at a school that now serves as temporary housing for displaced Ukrainians.
I wanted to come on Mother's Day. I thought it was important to show the Ukrainian people that this war has to stop. And this war has been brutal, and that the people of the United States stand with the people of Ukraine.
And of course, those children and parents displaced by war are close to all our hearts. And so for our parting shots tonight, we bring you a story from Romania, the country doing its bit to support Ukrainians suffering from that war. Of the nearly 5.9 million people fleeing Ukraine, more than 800,000 have sought safe haven in Romania, and its citizens and NGOs have mobilized to support and welcome those refugees as best they can. After a long journey, a welcome rest, Bucharest's North train station for those escaping the horrors of the war in Ukraine. Cristina Roșu is one of the hundreds of volunteers supporting the new arrivals.
Society took the Ukrainians in their houses, fed them, took great care of them. But in long term, this is not something the civil society can sustain. So my concern is that the government has to step in, prepare for what's going to happen.
More than 800,000 refugees have fled Ukraine to seek refuge in Romania since the start of the war, according to the UN. Some, like Valentina and her family, have been living rent-free as guests of generous Romanians.
We were very surprised because we didn't expect. We thought that we come here and be like on our own. We are very thankful, grateful for the help.
For many volunteers, it's also important to help new arrivals feel welcomed in other ways, especially the young ones.
Most of them managed to escape with 1 or 2 suitcases, so toys for the kids were really not a priority. They came with really nothing, so every day we try to bring in toys. Now that the weather is with us and the spring has come, we made an action and we provide like 40 football and basketballs. We're trying to comfort them with the stuff that are considered a little bit not of a luxury but also non-essential.
Max and his team delivered toys, books and games to the refugee children in and around Bucharest.
We try to provide them every condition so they can live like every person, you and me, and forget about this refugee status. So they're not refugees, they're people, they're person, which for most of them will start a new life or need a life waiting for them to come back.
A small act of kindness making a big difference amidst the chaos of conflict. All right, and if you would like to safely and securely help people either in Ukraine or those who have fled, who may be in need of food, shelter and water, please go to cnn.com/impact and you'll find several ways that you can help. And thanks so very much for joining us. That was Connect the World. I'm Eleni Jokos in Dubai. CNN's coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues after this short break. Stay safe.
Hello everyone, I'm Zain Asher in New York, and this is One World. Russia is marking its World War II Victory Day with a mix of pageantry and propaganda. In Moscow's Red Square, President Vladimir Putin presided over a military parade where he repeated a baseless justification for invading Ukraine. He falsely claimed that Russia was being threatened by NATO forces as well, neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and that he had no choice but to fight back. That false narrative was echoed by pro-Russian forces and civilians in eastern Ukraine. Russian media reported that in Kherson, crowds held a procession honoring soldiers of the Great Patriotic War for the first time. One official said their aim was to integrate with Russia. Back in Moscow, Mr. Putin also marched in a procession for soldiers of World War II, and he had a message for the service members currently fighting in the Donbass region.
I am now addressing our armed forces and the militias of Donbass. You are fighting for the motherland, for its future, so that no one forgets the lessons of the Second World War, so that there is no place in the world for executioners, punishers, and Nazis.
And just as Mr. Putin was speaking in Moscow, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky released a message of his own. In a video marking Victory Day in his country, he pledged that Ukraine would triumph over Russia, just as it had triumphed over Nazi Germany.
Very soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine, and someone won't have any. We won then, and we will win now. Happy victory over Nazism Day.
CNN's Matthew Chance is in Moscow covering Russia's celebrations. We do want to remind our viewers that Russia has actually introduced very strict laws about how the war in Ukraine is described and has prohibited the broadcast of information it considers false.
We got an invite this year to be in the stands, and so it gave me a sort of bird's eye view, up close view of this, always very spectacular display of Russian military might, of Russian national pride. And it's particularly poignant, of course, this year because it comes against the backdrop of that brutal conflict that is taking place in Ukraine. And, Vladimir Putin, in his speech, which he makes every year to this parade, said that, as you mentioned, that Russia was facing an imminent threat and that it had to act defensively and preemptively. And so he yet again gave these justifications, offering no support for them, I have to say, for the military campaign in Ukraine, what Russia calls its special military operation. And that's been rejected, of course, by Ukraine and its allies. It was also a spectacular sort of a bit of theatre as well, because you saw 11,000 troops march in step with each other across the cobbles of Red Square. That was followed by a display of Russian military hardware, including tanks and rocket launchers and even intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the full array almost of Russia's arsenal. There was meant to be an air display as well, but because of bad weather, we're told by the Kremlin, and it was very cloudy out there today and rainy out in Moscow, that air dimension of the parade was cancelled. And so it was a bit more muted, a bit smaller than we'd anticipated. There's also been quite a lot of anticipation that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, was going to use this parade as an opportunity to make an important announcement about the special military operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine. Maybe he was going to, say it was going to become make a formal declaration of war. Maybe announce some kind of mobilization of forces to bring extra power to bear on the front lines there. But none of that happened. So, Vladimir Putin held back from doing that at this parade. But there was also nothing that he said, nothing that we heard or saw that would give an indication that Vladimir Putin or Russia is backing off and its military objectives inside Ukraine at this stage either, Zain.
Joining me live to discuss all of this is Sir Andrew Wood. He is the former British ambassador to Russia and a fellow at Chatham House, specialising in Russia and Eurasia. So Wood, thank you so much for being with us. So obviously you listened to Vladimir Putin's speech. What was your first reaction?
I think in a way he couldn't be expected to say anything because there was nothing particular to celebrate. The general bent I had was that he's a bit uncertain as to what to do next. he rolled out all the standard stuff about how they're full of Nazis and so on, and it's all the fault of the West. But it was a bit unsubstantial in itself.
Were you anticipating, like many others, that he would use the opportunity, use Victory Day, use May 9th, to fully declare war on Ukraine, as opposed to it simply being, which it is now, a special military operation?
No, I didn't think that, because it's quite a risky thing for him to do. If you declare war, you have to militarize the whole of Russia. You would get a lot more conscripts in theory, but in practice you wouldn't improve your army for that moment. So I think it would create a lot of anxiety within Russia itself, which wouldn't have been good.
Okay, so from your perspective,
he has to consider. I'm sorry. He has to consider whether he really wants to go for a full-scale operation to seize, in effect, the whole of Ukraine, which the military would like him to be able to do, but which so far they haven't been able to do.
So given the fact that this war clearly hasn't gone the way Vladimir Putin had anticipated it would go 2.5 months or so ago, just given the casualties we're seeing on the Russian side, given the fact that they thought this was going to be a very quick and easy operation.
I'm sorry, you're coming across, I can't really hear you now.
Okay, I'm going to speak louder for you. I was just sort of saying that, given the fact that this war has not gone the way that Vladimir Putin has anticipated or had anticipated that it would go, what are his options now?
Well, again, that'd be a very risky throw to start talking about nuclear weaponry and what they could do, and with their huge Satan II rocket, they could flatten Great Britain or something like that. It wouldn't really move things on. And I think that he must be getting some sense of the distress at troop level, if you like, in the army about the way they're having to fight, and the doubt in a higher reach of the army as to whether he's fighting hard enough. So I think it was safer for him to leave things to gestate for a bit and just see how things go. That said, of course, if he wants to declare martial law, he can do it at a later stage. I just felt there was an element of doubt.
And just in terms of, the actual contents of the speech itself, obviously there was so much propaganda. He obviously reiterated the lines about wanting to denazify Ukraine, and there was so much propaganda in terms of how the war actually started, but him claiming to believe that there was a threat from the West and that Russia had to act preemptively. How does that give us a sense of how this war is being packaged and sold to the Russian people?
I think the feelings of the Russian people are in reality rather mixed. They don't like the idea of war, and they certainly wouldn't like the idea of full threat war. They feel compelled by fear of Putin, and also fear that what's being said by the West has some element of truth in it. They're more or less compelled to show a good deal of outward support for what he's doing. But in truth, I think this is a moment of tension and doubt on both sides. That is, Kiev as well as Moscow, because the battle hasn't really been joined in the Donbass area. So I think nobody really does know what's going to happen there, and it's also perhaps to Putin's tactical advantage to keep doubt as to what he intends to do, how he will do it, and so on, until there's a sort of better feeling somewhere about what's going to happen. My view is that he cannot win this war, even if he manages to conquer the whole of Ukraine, which is unlikely. But if he managed to do that, he wouldn't be able to keep control of it. If he did win the war in that sense, he would also be responsible for curing the huge, cruel damage that he's done. And thirdly, there is a significant moral issue for us and for Ukraine, of course, and for Russia. Russia has shamed itself by its actions, and a good collection of Russian people sense that, even if they can't say it, and they wonder where it's all going. So I think this is a moment of doubt, and he thought it was best to leave it to run on for a bit and see what happens.
Yeah, but as you point out, no easy way out of this for Vladimir Putin. As you also point out, his intentions, were to probably throw us off, knowing that a lot of analysts would be combing through every single word of that speech. And all right, Sir Andrew Wood, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much. All right, to Berlin now, where the French president is meeting the German chancellor. These are pictures from just moments ago as two leaders reviewed the troops. It's Macron's first trip since his re-election, and it comes just a few hours after Macron met other EU leaders, where he reiterated his support for Ukraine. Let's bring in Jim Bitterman, who's following the story from Paris. So, Jim, just walk us through this. Obviously, a key item on the agenda is, of course, going to be the war between Russia and Ukraine, but also defense and energy as well, because that is, of course, how Russia is financing this war.
Absolutely, Zane. Those are going to be the hot topics as these two men meet. One of the probably cold topics is what to say about Ukraine, because Olaf Scholz has basically been on exactly the same wavelength as Emmanuel Macron, saying that Ukraine, Scholz saying, cannot possibly lose this war, at least as far as the Europeans are concerned, basically because they just don't think that the kind of injustice and awful things that we've seen from Russia can be allowed to stand. So very much on the same wavelength in terms of their policy towards Ukraine, but they may differ in other areas. On the Ukraine, in fact, here's a little bit of what President Emmanuel Macron said earlier today to the members of the European Parliament. You can see clearly where he stands.
What is our goal? Faced with the unilateral decision of Russia to invade Ukraine and aggress its people, to ensure this war concludes as soon as possible, to do everything to ensure that Ukraine will survive, Russia will never win.
And earlier in the day, there was also a conversation between Volodymyr Zelensky and the president of the European Commission, Madame van der Leyen. And in fact, in that conversation, Madame van der Leyen said that they had received the second of the multi-stage application process for Ukraine to become part of the European Union. That's a process that she said could be addressed by the Commission as early as June. However, Mr. Macron said that it could take years or maybe even a decade before that would actually come into realization that Ukraine would be part of the European Union. But it's clearly something that Zelensky and Ukraine would like to see happen very quickly. Zane?
Jim Bitterman, live for us there. Thank you so much. Right, Russian forces in Ukraine may have moved across a pontoon bridge they built on a major river in the east. It is near an important base in the town of Bakhmut. There in the center of your screen, and could threaten Ukrainian defenses and supply routes in the Luhansk region. CNN confirms that the bridge wasn't there a week ago. Meantime, Ukrainians report a significant uptick in missile attacks in the south along the Black Sea coast and in the city of Odessa as well. And a warning, I want to show you some new video that you might find disturbing. This was actually just released by the Mariupol City Council. Footage that appears to be mass graves and bodies in bags on the ground east of the port city. Early estimates show that tens of thousands of people have died in Mariupol in the last 10 weeks. Despite that ongoing horror, one pro-Russian separatist leader in the region says he has plans to turn Mariupol into a resort town. Dozens of people are feared dead after Russia bombed a school in Luhansk over the weekend where Ukrainians were sheltering. This is an area, take a look here, where the fighting has been raging since the early days of Russia's invasion. There were 90 people inside the building when the bomb hit. 27 thankfully got out alive. CNN's Sam Kiley met with some of the survivors.
This, for Vladimir Putin, is what a modern Russian victory looks like.
Dozens dead or missing from a Russian airstrike on a Russian-speaking village as part of a Russian campaign that Putin says is to protect his kinfolk in Ukraine. The rescuers are saying the heat's overwhelming. Local authorities fear about 60 people died here. This was a school in Bilohorivka in eastern Ukraine. Villagers were sheltering in its basement. Some had been there for weeks. Survivors were left with little but grief. We asked if his family had been with him. His mother didn't survive.
It is not lost on anybody here that on the eve of Vladimir Putin's celebration of the Soviet victory in the Second World War over Nazi Germany, it is civilians who are suffering the most in the name of Vladimir Putin's denazification of Ukraine, a country with a Jewish president.
I got slammed down by a slab, bent into a ball. Then another explosion, small rocks sprinkled, darkness. Then I looked, and the dust settled and a ray of light appeared. Sergei crawled out, and then he dug me out, dug Uncle Tolya out, dug Aunt Ira out. We crawled, all in a fog, he said. Ukraine has stalled Russia's plans for conquest, so the Kremlin's added strategic sites like oil supplies to its target list and stepped up its airstrikes against civilians in eastern Ukraine, this week hitting a residential block in the strategic city of Kramatorsk. Ukrainian politicians refer to Putin's campaign ideology as a fascist creed they call Russism. Speaking soon after the latest airstrike, he said they shoot prisoners, they torture women and children, they rape, they loot. They go step by step towards Nazism. Such explanations for what is happening here don't really answer the painful question, why? Sam Kiley, CNN, Bakhmut.
All right, still to come here on One World. Splattered with red paint, a Russian ambassador gets doused by angry protesters in Poland. What they were upset about and how Russia is responding. Plus, he was once President Vladimir Putin's prime minister. Now he supports Ukraine. Mikhail Kasnayov shares his insights on what Putin's plans might be moving forward. In Warsaw, a group of people protested the war in Ukraine by throwing red paint on Russia's ambassador to Poland. You can actually see in the video, the ambassador was actually about to lay flowers at a cemetery before he was doused with the liquid. Russia's embassy condemned the incident, saying it would submit a formal protest to Polish authorities. The foreign ministry in Poland said the incident was, quote, regrettable. Russia's severe crackdown on dissent has likely quashed many such protests within the country. In fact, large, faithful crowds attended today's Victory Day events in Moscow. They listened on as Vladimir Putin repeated baseless accusations to sell his war. Some world leaders thought the Russian president might use this moment to declare triumph in Ukraine. He, of course, did not. The US ambassador to the UN told CNN exclusively that's because he can't legitimately claim a win.
President Putin has recognized he has no victory to celebrate. His efforts in Ukraine have not succeeded. He was not able to go into Ukraine and bring them to their knees in a few days and have them surrender. He gave up on taking Kyiv, and he has moved to reassess his positioning in Ukraine. So there was no victory to celebrate. There was no reason for him to either declare victory or declare a war that he has already been carrying on for more than 2 months.
So President Putin can't claim victory, so what exactly is his next move? Someone who might have insight on that is Mikhail Kasyanov. He's a Russian politician who was once Mr. Putin's prime minister. Now, though, he supports Ukraine. Mr. Kasyanov joins us live now from an undisclosed location in Eastern Europe. Mikhail, thank you so much for being with us. So we just heard there several reasons why Vladimir Putin was unable to declare victory during this Victory Day parade. However, a lot of people thought that he would use this opportunity, this speech, to perhaps declare war on Ukraine as opposed to it being a special military operation. Clearly, he decided against that. Why do you think that is?
Yes, and it was not possible for Mr. Putin to declare a war and to call for mobilization. To call for mobilization, you need to declare war in accordance with Russian constitution. To declare the war, you need to have invasion. There was some shootings on the border with Russia, but Russian propaganda, Putin's propaganda, didn't use it for that. To recognize the war and to declare the war and call for mobilization, it means recognize just weakness. It means just, as he called it, special operation was not successful. And in fact, it is not successful. And that's why it was not possible for Mr. Putin to recognize unsuccess. It means he will continue to fight in the same manner. He is very nervous. His speech today was absolutely useless, without any enthusiasm and a demonstration of apparent weakness.
All right, so by declaring war against Ukraine, in a sense, he would be admitting that what he has done in Ukraine so far, the special operation, has basically failed, and he doesn't want to do that. So then, what is his strategy moving forward? How does he win this?
Yeah, he's, as I said, he's nervous. He didn't expect it. He didn't expect just such a tough sanctions would be imposed. It really tough touched Russian economy, a financial system already in
He must have expected that tough sanctions would be imposed. He must have known that was coming.
No, he thought that the level of sanctions would be like it was in 2014 after annexation of Crimea, which he easily overcame. But this time the sanctions were really devastating for Russian economy. And he understands that now just the whole operation, the whole war with Ukraine turns to, I would say, competition or war of economic potentials, economic and military potentials. And the Ukraine, with the, I would say, great military supplies from the United States and other countries, just could get a decisive advantage in the battlefield. That's what Mr. Putin is afraid. That's why he needs just to go further on the coming couple of weeks.
So there was clearly a massive miscalculation. And even though Western leaders had warned, even before the invasion, that there were going to be harsh sanctions. He didn't anticipate that they were going to be this bad. And on top of that, there's now discussion of an oil embargo. Of course, that is how Russia has been paying for this war. So if, you know, the West clamps down on energy exports from Russia, if you know, Vladimir Putin's methods of paying for this war is threatened in that way, plus you've got all the Russian casualties, what happens next? What is his strategy going forward?
Yeah, I think that just his strategy would be definitely to keep this corridor he already managed to create between Crimea, land corridor, between Crimea and Donbass. He tries to expand the occupied territory of Donbass, not quite successful as so far, but the land corridor already exists, and he cannot move furthermore. And as I said, his speech was recognition of unsuccess of the operation, although he called for future victory, but there was no victory as of today.
So Western leaders are, of course, going to be combing through the speech, analyzing every single word. What do you think the main takeaway should be for Europe, the United States, of course, NATO as a whole?
I think just G7 recently made a very important statement a couple of days ago. The statement was devoted exactly for this issue, and they jointly said just we need to see Mr. Putin as defeated. That is the beginning. If it happens, that will be beginning of the end of Putin's era. It would last for a few months, maybe 1 year, but definitely just combination of these factors, the huge support of Ukraine, moral and military supplies, and simultaneously just create a weakness of Putin's ability to fund this war. That would create a situation when Mr. Putin will look as defeated. It means just internal turmoil, internal protests will grow up in Russia, and that will be, as I said, the regime change by the hands of Russians.
I mean, it's just so hard to tell, especially, you know, being outside of Russia, just how strong the genuine support is for Vladimir Putin. Obviously, there are people who genuinely support him. There are people who pretend to support him. There are people who secretly do not support him. But how do you think ordinary Russian people, ordinary civilians, would interpret this speech he made today?
I would say the society is split by 50-50 these days. And in fact, there's half of population which were fooled by very sophisticated propaganda, and they're listening to this propaganda and they believe to Mr. Putin and they support him. For them, they would applaud this speech and they will continue to believe that the victory would be achieved very soon. But other 50% of population who don't support this war and this criminal activity of Mr. Putin's regime, of course, they're keeping silence and waiting just when the situation will start changing. And by little efforts, they cannot afford just great efforts and to have a protest on the streets, because last year Mr. Putin spent all the time to create a fear among people and put lots of people in jail to demonstrate how harsh that his reaction would be if any demonstration appears. And today these people just waiting for some kind of weakness. Today's speech for them, it's a signal that Mr. Putin has started weakening.
All right, Mikhail, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your perspective, because of course you know Vladimir Putin personally, so that is a valuable insights that you've offered. Thank you. At this hour, Sri Lanka is in chaos. Thousands have taken to the streets demanding an end to the worst economic crisis there in half a century. Details on the fallout coming up. Hello and welcome back to One World. Political uncertainty in Sri Lanka after one of the country's top leaders resigns. The Prime Minister, who by the way is also the President's brother, has stepped down. It follows weeks of violent clashes between pro and anti-government protesters amid Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis in decades. Sri Lanka's National Hospital says that 151 people have been injured during Monday's protests. A nationwide curfew is actually now in effect. For more on this, let's bring in Will Ripley, who joins us live now. So, Will, this is the worst economic crisis the country has been dealing with since 1948, since independence from Britain. Take us through what people on the ground there in Sri Lanka are going through.
Well, on the ground, they can't get gas for cooking. They can't get petroleum. The country can't pay off its loans, and you're talking about, 51 million US dollars. They don't have the cash. They don't have any sort of ability to borrow more money because their credit is so bad. They're reaching out to the IMF for a bailout. They've borrowed a lot of money from China. People can't get lines of credit at the bank. So small businesses are struggling. Even larger businesses are struggling because not only can they not get the commodities they need, but there's just no money circulating around. And people are really blaming the Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and his brother, because, by the way, the Prime Minister has actually served 4 terms as Prime Minister, and he's also been president twice. So this is a political dynasty, a family that anti-government protesters, Zane, have accused of corruption and financial mismanagement. And also they don't like the fact that former presidents get a house, a car, a staff, an office, security, and salary for life. I mean, where they're struggling on, to make ends meet.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, we're seeing pictures, we're actually seeing some video as well of the clashes between pro and anti-government activists. Just explain to us, now that the Prime Minister has resigned, does that mean that the protesters are now satisfied? What more do they want at this point?
They're angry at the family. So the Prime Minister wrote a letter to his brother, the President, suggesting an all-party interim government to try to sit down and let's talk and let's figure this out. The problem is that they're angry at everyone in the family, accusing the brother and the Prime Minister of corruption, essentially. And you have now the Prime Minister gone, but you still, for weeks he held back. He didn't want to do it because they're obviously very powerful. There was civil unrest happening since March, weeks of anti-government protests that turned violent despite a nationwide curfew and police and paramilitary and military. None of it worked. None of it quelled the violence. So the question is now, will it? Will the protesters, will this be enough for them for now, or are they going to continue to demand that the president also step down? He still has about 2 years left on his term, Zane.
But as you mentioned, they have a problem with the entire family. All right, Will Ripley, live for us there. Thank you so much. Right, polls are now closed, or rather a son of a former dictator is poised to become the next leader of the Philippines. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., also known as Bongbong, is the son of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. He's favored to win and replace controversial leader Rodrigo Duterte. In fact, unofficial results from CNN Philippines shows that it's likely to be a landslide win for Marcos Jr. Ivan Watson has more.
Election history is in the making in the Philippines. Unofficial preliminary results suggest that one candidate for president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., nicknamed Bongbong, appears to be winning by a landslide, with perhaps more than twice the votes of his nearest rival. In which case, this would truly be an historic moment, because he campaigned on a platform of unity, on a platform of nostalgia, and may have succeeded in rewriting history, because of course his father was the former Philippines dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who was ousted in 1986 in a people power movement after ruling with martial law for nearly a decade, with a horrific human rights record and allegations of wild corruption that are still being investigated to this day. But what we've seen so far is that Bongbong Marcos Jr. was able to convince millions of Filipino voters that those accusations and allegations were not important, and that he could bring back some kind of, as he put it, golden age to the Philippines. one of the biggest challenges going forward and one of the top concerns on many voters' minds is the economy in this archipelago. Of course, the Philippines took a battering during the COVID pandemic economically, and that's going to be a big challenge. Inflation, unemployment, things like that. This day of elections appears to have been a victory not just for one political dynasty, but for two, because Bongbong Marcos Jr.'s running mate for vice president was Sara Duterte Carpio. She is the daughter of the outgoing, very controversial Philippines president Rodrigo Duterte, accused of crimes against humanity for his deadly drug war. These two political dynasties allied have convinced millions of Filipino voters to take a bet on them, to vote for them. And again, an historic result. It may be one of the biggest electoral mandates for a presidential candidate in generations. Ivan Watson, CNN, Hong Kong.
Tempers continue to boil over across China over strict COVID-19 lockdowns. As we see here in this video that is circulating, it shows people who live in one district in Shanghai bursting through their building gate and clashing with government workers. For weeks, we've been following shocking stories about citizens being barricaded in their homes or neighborhoods, unable to get food, unable to get medicine, just trapped. Right now, at least 31 cities across the country are under some kind of lockdown, impacting potentially hundreds of millions of people. This coming despite the fact that infection rates there are relatively low. In Hong Kong, Chief Executive Carrie Lam just met with her newly confirmed successor, John Lee. Lee was selected on Sunday as the city's next leader by members of a Chinese government-vetted committee. In a short statement, Lee said there are major tasks that need to be accomplished before he takes office on July 1st, including finalizing plans of government reorganizations and COVID-19 policies. He did not provide specific details about those changes. All right, still to come here on One World, the latest from that Mariupol steel plant that Russia has been shelling for weeks. What the Ukrainian military is saying about the fighters still inside. The southern Ukrainian port city of Mariupol has been decimated by weeks of bombardment, and it's now almost entirely under Russian control, except here, the site of the sprawling Azovstal steel plant. That's where a group of Ukrainian soldiers are still holed up, refusing to surrender and vowing to fight to the death, to the bitter end. The Ukrainian military says that Russia is relentlessly shelling and bombing the plant, calling it a storm offensive. CNN's Scott McLean has been following developments in Mariupol. He joins us live now from Lviv. So, Scott, we know that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers are still trapped inside this plant. In fact, the Azov Regiment lieutenant said in a statement, or a press conference rather, yesterday, we can't just leave, we have to be evacuated. We are basically dead men. Most of us know this. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so one other thing that soldier from the Azov regiment, this part of the Ukrainian military that's been leading the fighting from that area, said is that there are dozens of civilians still left. Now, no one from the Ukrainian government has backed that up or said anything to indicate that that's true, but the statements have been that women, children, and elderly have been evacuated, so I suppose that it's possible that there are civilian men who perhaps were not taken out through those evacuation corridors or those evacuation convoys organized by the United Nations and the Red Cross. So yeah, you mentioned there's hundreds of soldiers. We're told hundreds of them are wounded and dying in agony, they say, because of course they're running out of supplies, they're running out of medicine, they don't have adequate supplies to keep these people alive and to keep them with any amount of comfort. And so they're in an impossible position. It is impossible to imagine these soldiers being able to fight their way out, considering they are surrounded by Russian troops, Russian heavy artillery. They've even moved boats closer to the port at last word to try to bomb the steel plant from the water as well. And so they are begging Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to try to work out some kind of a deal to get them out of the steel plant alive in one piece. But they say that they're not going to leave without a weapon in their hands. And so essentially they're left to fight until the death, because they say that if they were to hand themselves over to the Russians, they say that the chances of surviving that would be zero. They don't think that the Russians are going to treat them in a humane way. They don't think that the Russians will live up to their promises to treat them according to international law. And of course, now you have word that that plant, even today, is still being bombed with tanks and with artillery. The Ukrainians are calling it a storm offensive, Zane.
All right, Scott McLean, live for us there. Thank you so much. In the meantime, North Korea is watching what happens in Ukraine very closely, and more importantly, the international reaction to Russia's actions. CNN's Paula Hancock explains.
Meeting for the first time in 2019, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin revived a decades-long alliance. North Korea has unsurprisingly sided with Russia, calling the US, quote, the root cause of the Ukrainian crisis, the war reinforcing a basic lesson.
Only one, but very important. Never, ever surrender your nuclear weapons. They have known it anyway for decades, and now they got yet another confirmation. After Iraq, after Libya.
Pyongyang often makes the connection between the former leaders of Iraq and Libya giving up their nuclear ambitions, then losing power and ultimately their lives. Ukraine agreed to transfer thousands of nuclear warheads to Russia after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. It did not have an independent weapons program.
But I think the war in Ukraine really affirms the North Korean view of how the world works. The North Koreans, I think, have persistently rejected the idea of any form of international order really having an effect on how states relate to each other.
Kim is experiencing the most favourable weapons testing environment he has seen in his 10 years in power. A split among United Nations Security Council permanent members, Russia and China on one side, the US, UK and France on the other, means the chances of punishing North Korea are zero.
It's quite clear that China and Russia will block additional sanctions, and frankly it's not quite clear what else can you possibly sanction.
North Korea has launched more than a dozen missiles already this year, including an intercontinental ballistic missile. Satellite imagery of the Punggye-ri underground testing site suggests a seventh nuclear test may also be imminent. North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. The thought it might try again has long been dismissed. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the West's refusal to fight directly against a nuclear power is at least raising the question.
Maybe, just maybe, this American president of the year 2045 or 2055 will not risk San Francisco in order to save Seoul.
North Korea could also benefit potentially from countries boycotting Russian oil and gas. Cash-strapped Pyongyang would be more than happy to pick up some of the slack for Moscow, potentially at a discount, and certainly would appreciate dealing with a country that no longer feels constrained by US-led sanctions. Paula Hancock's CNN Seoul.
All right, coming up, a surprise visit as the First Ladies of the US and Ukraine share a moment on Mother's Day. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a trip to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky on Sunday. During his visit, Mr. Trudeau announced that Canada will supply more military aid to Ukraine and reopen its embassy in Kyiv. Meantime, American diplomats returned to the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv for the first time since the war in Ukraine began. They timed their visit on Sunday to commemorate Victory in Europe Day.
When Secretary of State Blinken was in Kyiv last month, he told President Zelensky that our team would return to the capital city promptly. So today, we're here to make good on that promise. And it really is great to be back.
The State Department says this was not an official reopening of the embassy, but a step in that direction. U.S. First Lady Jill Biden is back on her way to the United States. She wrapped up her 4-day European tour a few hours ago, a trip that included meetings with world leaders as well as with refugees from the war in Ukraine. The highlight was a surprise visit to Ukraine on Sunday, Mother's Day. CNN's Kate Bennett has been traveling with the First Lady and has this report.
A Mother's Day surprise from Jill Biden, making an unannounced visit to Ukraine.
I wanted to come on Mother's Day. I thought it was important to show the Ukrainian people that this war has to stop. And this war has been brutal. And that People of the United States stand with the people of Ukraine.
A tightly choreographed and secretive addition to her solo 4-day trip to Romania and Slovakia. The First Lady not only going into a war-torn country, but adding a visit with Ukrainian First Lady Olena Zelenska. Zelenska in hiding since February, the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sunday was the first time emerging in public for a one-on-one with Jill Biden.
First of all, I would like to thank you for a very courageous act. Because we understand what it takes for the U.S. First Lady to come here during a war where the military actions are taking place every day, where the air sirens are happening every day and even today.
A First Lady has not visited an active war zone by herself in years. The last one, Laura Bush, who made 2 solo visits to Afghanistan. But for Biden, the surprise Ukraine visit, though it lasted just shy of 2 hours, was in many ways a sure thing for a First Lady who has for weeks expressed concern and dismay about the destruction of Ukraine.
Like all of us, my heart has ached watching videos of Ukraine.
This trip, which has included stops in Romania and Slovakia, was to spend time with victims of Russia's brutality, Ukrainian mothers and children, refugees in new countries, welcomed, but just hoping to go home again.
You want to hear her message? Tell them your message. What is your name?
I want to return to my father.
Biden hearing the harrowing stories of mothers this Mother's Day, not knowing where they will go or how long they will stay, sharing with the First Lady herself on a mission to show support from America.
I thank not only Romania but also the U.S. is helping us, not only supporting the refugees but actually in our fight. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. We stand with you. I hope you know that.
We know.
It was her surprise trip to Uzhgorod, about a 15-minute drive from the Slovakian border in the southwestern part of Ukraine, that truly defined this 4-day European trip for Biden. A teacher meeting her Ukrainian counterpart in a former school that has been transformed into housing for citizens displaced by the war.
They're going to give it to their mothers.
And honoring Mother's Day herself, wearing a corsage of flowers on her wrist, a gift sent to her by her husband, President Joe Biden.
Thank you. Happy Mother's Day. Thank you. Stay strong.
Kate Bennett, CNN, Bratislava, Slovakia.
And there was one more surprise visit to Ukraine on Sunday. The legendary rock band U2 performed a concert in a subway station that doubles as a bomb shelter in Kyiv. Singer Bono and guitarist The Edge were joined by a Ukrainian pop star who is now fighting with the Ukrainian military to sing the song Stand By Me.
Could you have you a message for, let's say, who'll be listening? A message for...
So powerful. U2 performed for 40 minutes and Bono told the crowd that of all the great cities in the world, there is nowhere, absolutely nowhere, that he would rather be than Kyiv. And a reminder to all of you at home, if you would like to safely and securely help people who are in Ukraine, who might be in need of housing, shelter, food, water, basic necessities, just go to cnn.com/impact. There it is right there on your screen. You can find several ways on that website to help. All right, thank you so much for watching One World. I'm Zain Asher. Amanpour is up next. You're watching CNN.
Won't you stand, won't you stand, won't you stand, won't you stand, stand by me? Could you have you a message for, let's say, who'll be listening? A message for the United States, a message for Joe Biden. What is your message?
Of course, yes, I have.
Do you have a message for Chancellor Scholz?
Not for Joe Biden, for a lot of people all over the world. all, I want to thank you, Bono, and you, the